My name is Hollis. I am 69 years old, and I spent my life building foundations from the ground up, only to watch my own son let his wife try to tear mine down. I was sitting in my favorite armchair watching the fourth quarter of the playoff game when my daughter-in-law snatched the remote from my hand and turned the screen black. "Go back to your room, old man," she told me. "This is our living room now." The funny thing was, I had paid for every single brick in that house. I did not argue. The next morning I called a moving company. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a hard lesson to someone who mistook your silence for weakness. The screen went pitch black just as the home team crossed the 20-yard line. I blinked, the sudden silence in the room ringing in my ears. Megan stood blocking the television, holding the remote like a weapon. She crossed her arms, her expensive designer blouse contrasting sharply with the nasty sneer on her face. I asked her politely to turn the game back on. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You have a small television in your bedroom down the hall," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You need to clear out right now. I am hosting my book club tomorrow, and I cannot have you sitting out here cluttering up my aesthetic." I shifted my gaze to Devin. My son, a man I raised to stand tall and speak the truth, was standing by the kitchen island. He carefully examined the laces of his Italian leather shoes, absolutely refusing to meet my eyes. He did not say a word to defend me. Megan saw me looking at him and smiled even wider. "Do not look at him," she snapped. Her manicured finger pointed directly at my face. "This is my living room. My name is on the mailbox outside, and I picked out the paint color on these walls. You are just a guest here, and you are overstaying your welcome." I looked at the walls. I looked at the custom molding I had installed with my own two hands. I looked back at Devin, waiting for the boy I raised to find his spine. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, and looked away again. The cowardice in his posture told me everything I needed to know. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw a tantrum. Anger is a cheap emotion, and I had learned long ago not to waste it on people who do not value respect. I stood up from my chair, smoothed the wrinkles from my trousers, and walked down the hallway to my room in absolute silence. Morning arrived with the crisp chill of a late autumn day. From my window, I watched Devin and Megan pull out of the driveway in their matching leased luxury sedans heading to their corporate jobs. They left exactly at 7:30. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy rumble of a diesel engine shook the driveway. My private moving crew had arrived. I opened the front door and let the 5 burly men inside. I handed the foreman a clipboard with a very specific, meticulously detailed inventory list. I had spent 40 years working as a master union carpenter in the brutal, unforgiving winters of Detroit. Every calloused line on my hands was earned by shaping raw wood into masterpieces. When I bought this house for Devin outright to give him a head start in life, I did not just hand over a blank check. I built the massive custom mahogany dining table that seated 12. I crafted the intricate shelving units framing the fireplace. I paid for the imported leather sofas out of my own hard-earned union pension. I walked through the first floor with the foreman pointing to exactly what belonged to me. I instructed the crew to be careful with the walls. I did not want to damage Megan's precious paint job. The men worked with military precision. They unbolted the heavy shelving from the studs. They dismantled the mahogany table piece by piece. They carried out the leather sofas, the Persian rugs I had bought at auction, and the antique side tables. I took only what I had built and what I had paid for with my own sweat and blood. Within 4 hours, the entire first floor was stripped down to the bare drywall and the original builder-grade carpet. Every trace of comfort, every ounce of luxury that I had provided vanished into the back of a large moving truck. The movers locked the heavy rear doors and drove away, leaving behind a hollow, echoing shell of a home. I did not leave the property. I simply went into the garage and retrieved a single metal folding chair. I set the metal folding chair in the exact center of the vast, empty living room. I sat down, crossed my legs, and unfolded the financial section of the daily newspaper. The acoustics of the room had changed completely. Without the thick rugs and the heavy wooden furniture absorbing the sound, every rustle of the paper echoed off the bare walls like a gunshot. I waited patiently. At 5 o'clock on the dot, the front door handle clicked. I heard Megan's high-pitched laugh echoing from the porch, followed by the chatter of her affluent white friends arriving for their highly anticipated cocktail hour. The heavy wooden door swung open. Megan stepped inside holding a bottle of expensive champagne, a bright, rehearsed smile plastered across her face. She took 2 steps into the foyer and froze completely. The champagne bottle slipped slightly in her grip. Her friends filed in behind her, their polite chatter dying instantly in their throats. They stared at the barren wooden floors. They looked at the empty spaces where the grand mahogany table used to sit. They saw the bare walls where the custom shelving had once displayed Megan's curated collection of meaningless trinkets. The grand, luxurious living room she loved to flaunt was completely gone, reduced to a hollow box. I turned the page of my newspaper, the crisp sound snapping harshly through the silence of the room. I did not look up immediately. I finished reading a detailed paragraph on municipal bonds, then slowly lowered the paper. I looked directly at Megan. The smug arrogance from the previous night had been entirely wiped from her face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. Her friends shifted uncomfortably, exchanging confused, horrified glances. They clearly had no idea what to do or say. Megan opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The pristine living room she claimed as her own was finally exactly what she had brought to this family. Absolutely empty. The crystal champagne flutes clattered against each other as Megan's affluent friends hastily backed out of the foyer. They mumbled incoherent excuses about leaving the stove on and completely ignored Megan's frantic pleas for them to stay. The heavy front door clicked shut, sealing the 3 of us inside the hollow, echoing space of the stripped living room. Megan dropped the expensive bottle of champagne. It hit the bare hardwood floor with a heavy thud, rolling away into the corner. She spun around to face me. Her face flushed a deep, violent crimson. She unleashed a piercing, hysterical scream that bounced off the blank drywall. She demanded to know where her custom leather sofas were. She demanded to know where the Persian rugs she had bragged about to her social club had gone. I simply turned the page of my newspaper. The crisp rustle of the paper cut through her shrieking. She unclasped her designer handbag, pulled out a thick luxury furniture catalog, and hurled it directly at my chest. It struck my shoulder and slapped against the floor. She ordered me to replace every single item I had stolen with brand new pieces from that catalog by tomorrow morning. Devin finally stepped out from behind the kitchen island. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project an authority he had never actually earned. He pointed a trembling finger at me, accusing me of intentionally humiliating his wife in front of the only people who mattered in this town. He called my actions petty and completely unacceptable. He demanded I apologize to Megan and bring the furniture back immediately. I slowly folded my newspaper and placed it perfectly square on my knee. I looked at the boy I had raised. I told him he was confused about the definition of theft. I explained that a man cannot steal what he legally owns. A habit born from 40 years working as a master union carpenter in Detroit was meticulous record-keeping. I informed Devin that I held the original itemized receipts for every single piece of furniture, every rug, and every piece of art that had just left the property in that moving truck. I paid for them with my own union pension. I told him that if Megan wanted a furnished living room, she could use her own credit card to buy it. I stood up from my metal folding chair and walked past them toward the hallway. Megan did not buy new furniture. Instead, she picked up her phone and dialed an emergency 24-hour locksmith. Less than an hour later, a heavy utility van pulled into the driveway. A man in a grease-stained uniform walked through the front door carrying a heavy cordless drill and a box of cheap commercial-grade hardware. I sat on my folding chair and watched the entire process in absolute silence. The locksmith marched from door to door. He drilled out the heavy custom brass lock sets I had personally installed on the master suite, the guest rooms, and the primary living areas. The high-pitched mechanical screech of the drill biting into the solid oak doors I had hung and leveled with my own hands echoed through the empty house. Megan stood behind the locksmith, crossing her arms and smiling with a hard, triumphant glint in her eyes. She was marking her territory. She was systematically erasing my access to the home I had purchased outright. When the locksmith finished his work and handed over the new ring of silver keys, Megan walked directly up to me. She did not yell this time. She spoke with a cold, calculated venom. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a single, jagged brass key. She shoved it forcefully against my chest. I caught it before it hit the floor. She pointed toward the narrow doorway at the end of the hall. She declared that the unfinished basement was my new permanent residence. She stated that since I wanted to behave like a stubborn, miserable old man, I could live like one in the dark. She explicitly forbade me from entering the kitchen or the upstairs bathrooms without her direct permission. Devin stood at the top of the staircase watching his wife banish his father to the underground concrete box. He looked away, completely complicit in his silence. I did not shed a tear. I did not beg for my old bedroom. I took the brass key, gripped it tightly in my palm, and walked toward the basement door. I descended the wooden steps I had framed 20 years ago, leaving them to their hollow victory above. The basement air was damp-heavy and smelled strongly of old concrete and neglected dust. The only light came from a single bare incandescent bulb hanging from the exposed floor joists above. The space was entirely unfinished, housing the water heater, the furnace, and a scattering of forgotten cardboard boxes. I needed to clear a space against the far wall to set up the military-style cot I had brought down with my bags. A rusted, heavy steel filing cabinet sat in the corner left behind from Devon's reckless college days. I planted my boots against the concrete floor, gripped the sides of the metal cabinet, and pushed with the strength I had maintained from decades on the construction site. The heavy metal screeched against the floor. As it shifted, the top corner of the cabinet scraped hard against the drywall, catching the edge of a loose, poorly installed air return vent. The metal vent popped off the wall and clattered onto the concrete. A cascade of crumpled, torn envelopes spilled out from the dark ductwork, fluttering down around my boots like dead leaves. I crouched down under the dim light of the bare bulb. I picked up the torn papers. The envelopes were marked with bold red ink. The return address belonged to a notorious predatory lending firm known for exploiting desperate borrowers. I flattened the torn edges against the top of the filing cabinet and pieced the shredded documents together like a puzzle. The bold text at the top of the page read, "Final Notice of Default." The documents revealed a massive high-interest second mortgage taken out against the property. The remaining balance was staggering, and the account was exactly 90 days past due. Devon had not just been living beyond his means. He had secretly leveraged the very house I bought him, plunging the property into catastrophic debt, and hidden the foreclosure notices in the basement walls. I smoothed out the torn edges of the heavy stock paper on the cold metal surface of the filing cabinet. The harsh red ink of the bank stamp glared under the dim basement bulb, screaming final notice. The mathematics of Devon's absolute betrayal were laid out in stark, undeniable numbers. He had taken out a massive second mortgage on the property without saying a single word to me. The total loan amount extracted from the equity was exactly $300,000. I traced the routing numbers printed on the subsequent pages of the bank summary. The funds had not been used for responsible home improvements or sound financial investments. Every single dollar had been systematically wired to a corporate account registered entirely to Megan's brother. I knew her brother. He was a parasitic opportunist running a failing tech startup that burned through investor cash and produced absolutely nothing. Devon had literally mortgaged the roof over his own head to fund the delusions of his wife's family. The most damning detail printed on the paper was the penalty date. The account was exactly 90 days past due. The lending firm was not issuing another warning. They were initiating immediate foreclosure proceedings. Megan and Devon were living in a house of cards that was already collapsing, and their brilliant solution was to lock me in the basement while they played pretend in an empty living room upstairs. I did not feel the heat of anger. I felt the cold, sharp clarity of a master carpenter calculating a catastrophic load-bearing failure. Devon had compromised the structural integrity of his entire life for a woman who viewed him as a walking credit line. I folded the documents precisely and placed them securely in my inner jacket pocket. I walked up the basement stairs, bypassing the locked interior door, and exited the house through the exterior side entrance. The morning air was sharp. I walked to my truck and started the engine. I needed to pay a visit to the business district. I drove downtown to the polished glass high-rise where my attorney, Mr. Hayes, operated his firm. Growing up in Detroit during the harsh era of redlining taught me a brutal, unforgiving lesson about property and ownership. The banks in the city systematically stripped wealth from people who looked like me by utilizing fine-print shifting boundaries and ruthless legal traps. I learned early in my youth that you never under any circumstances surrender your leverage. Trust is a beautiful concept, but legal control is an impenetrable shield. When I purchased the house for Devon outright, I transferred the deed into his name to provide him with a substantial tax benefit. But I did not walk away completely exposed. I instructed Mr. Hayes to embed a highly specific ironclad hidden covenant deep within the transfer paperwork. The clause dictated that my private holding company retain the absolute first right of repossession in the event of any loan default. If any lending institution attempted to foreclose on the property, my corporate entity automatically intercepted the action and assumed full ownership of both the debt and the physical asset. Devon had signed the heavy stack of paperwork years ago without bothering to read the fine print, entirely blinded by the magnitude of the gift. I walked into Mr. Hayes' office and placed the torn bank notices directly on his mahogany desk. I instructed him to activate the covenant immediately. Mr. Hayes reviewed the 90-day default status and nodded in silent agreement. He picked up his phone and executed the legal mechanisms that formally intercepted the bank foreclosure process. Within 15 minutes, the original lending firm was neutralized and paid off through my corporate reserve. My private company was now the sole undisputed lien holder of the $300,000 debt. Devin no longer owed a faceless bureaucratic lending firm. He owed his father. I instructed Mr. Hayes to prepare the formal eviction protocols, but to hold the delivery until my explicit command. I wanted to tighten the vice on my own schedule. I shook my attorney hand, took my certified copies of the newly filed legal actions, and drove back to the suburban estate. I parked my truck in the driveway and walked around to the exterior basement door. Before I could even turn my brass key in the lock, I heard the distinct heavy thud of footsteps echoing violently through the floorboards above my head. The disruptive noise was accompanied by the loud scraping of hard plastic luggage wheels and the sharp, arrogant commands of unfamiliar voices. I walked up the interior basement stairs and unlocked the heavy wooden door connecting to the main hallway. The grand foyer was completely cluttered with expensive leather suitcases and designer travel bags. Megan's parents were actively moving their belongings into my former master bedroom on the first floor. Megan's mother was complaining loudly to her daughter about the bizarre lack of furniture in the living room. Her father was dragging a massive steel-reinforced trunk directly across the polished hardwood floor, leaving deep, permanent scratches in the custom finish I had installed. Megan stood by the kitchen island, smiling brightly and completely ignoring the property damage as she welcomed them to what she proudly called their new summer retreat. Her father spotted me standing quietly in the hallway. He did not offer a greeting. He did not extend a handshake. He marched directly up to me with a profound sneer on his face, holding a sharply printed piece of paper. He shoved the paper forcefully against my chest. He informed me that since I was occupying space and living rent-free in his daughter's basement, I needed to make myself immediately useful. The paper contained a highly detailed typed list of grueling maintenance chores. It explicitly demanded that I clean the second-story gutters, repair the guest bathroom plumbing, and pull weeds in the extensive backyard before sunset. He looked me up and down with absolute unfiltered disdain. He told me I needed to earn my keep and pull my own weight if I wanted to continue staying in his daughter house. I looked down at the typed chore list. I looked back up at the arrogant man standing inside a house that my private corporation now legally possessed in its entirety. I folded the piece of paper perfectly in half, placed it in my shirt pocket, and gave him a slow, calculating nod. Megan's mother did not unpack her own bags. She stood in the center of the kitchen, inspecting her manicured nails, and snapped her fingers at me exactly twice. The sharp sound echoed against the bare walls I had stripped just days prior. She pointed a long, bony finger toward the heavy steel trunk sitting in the hallway. She told me to carry it to the master bedroom immediately and be careful not to scuff the hardwood. Megan's father walked past me, handing me a freshly printed list. He did not say good morning. He informed me that the guest bathroom plumbing was making a terrible noise. The front gutters were overflowing with autumn leaves and the backyard required immediate weeding. Megan leaned against the granite island, sipping a mimosa. She smiled, watching her parents issue commands in the house my money had built. She told her parents not to worry because I was used to taking orders from my betters. She casually remarked that 40 years of blue-collar grunt work in the Detroit Carpenters Union made me perfectly suited for manual labor. She said it was better to keep an old dog busy, so he does not forget his place in the hierarchy. I looked at the typed list in my hand. The arrogance was staggering, but it was also incredibly useful. Pride is a fragile shield, and I had discarded mine decades ago when survival required a colder, more practical mindset. I did not glare at them. I did not point out that the house they were standing in was legally encumbered by my private holding company. I simply folded the piece of paper, placed it securely in my shirt pocket, and gave Megan's father a polite, slow nod. I walked down to the basement and strapped on my heavy leather tool belt. The belt felt familiar, a reassuring weight against my hips. They thought they were degrading me by treating me like the hired help. They did not realize they were giving the architect of their ruin full and unrestricted access to the entire property. I grabbed my wrench and headed upstairs to begin my work. I started my assigned chores in the garage. Megan's father claimed he was building a custom wine rack and a private gym space. He had brought in unlicensed contractors last month while I was away visiting an old union brother. I walked the perimeter of the three-car garage, pulling a high-resolution digital camera from my pocket. What I found was not a simple cosmetic remodel. Her father had ordered the contractors to remove a central load-bearing column to open up the floor plan for his exercise equipment. He had replaced the industrial-grade steel with cheap, completely inadequate timber supports. The ceiling joists above the missing column were already showing severe hairline fractures under the immense weight of the second floor. It was a catastrophic structural violation. I documented the cracking wood, the removed supports, and the sloppy, uninsulated electrical wiring they had run illegally across the ceiling. Every photograph was a localized weapon. During my time in the union, I spent 10 years acting as a senior commercial site inspector. I knew the municipal building codes like I knew the back of my own hand. This specific unauthorized modification was not just dangerous, it constituted a massive breach of the property's master insurance policy. It fundamentally devalued the asset by thousands of dollars. I moved to the guest bathroom. I fixed the plumbing issue in exactly 4 minutes. It was merely a simple loose gasket, but I spent another 20 minutes photographing the unauthorized luxury fixtures they had installed without pulling the proper city permits. I walked the exterior property lines, meticulously documenting the unapproved landscaping changes that altered the designated drainage paths and caused water to pool against the foundation. I compiled every photograph, every building code violation, and every structural liability into a secure digital folder. I routed the comprehensive damage report directly to Mr. Hayes' encrypted email server. Megan and her family believed they were upgrading their lifestyle. In reality, they were generating an airtight legal case for gross property destruction. I was actively building the invoice they would inevitably be forced to pay. I wiped the heavy black grease from my hands and grabbed my aluminum extension ladder. It was time to clear the gutters. I positioned the heavy aluminum ladder against the side of the house, anchoring it firmly against the damp earth. The autumn wind was biting, but the physical labor kept me warm and focused. I climbed steadily, reaching the roofline directly adjacent to the master bedroom suite. The large bay window was cracked open a few inches to let in the crisp morning air. I began clearing the rotting wet leaves from the metal gutter with my gloved hands. As I pulled a heavy handful of debris, I heard Megan's voice drifting clearly through the open window. She was speaking rapidly, her tone thick with desperate, breathless excitement. I paused, my movements crouching low on the ladder, and listened. She was not talking to Devin. She was speaking to a luxury real estate broker. She told the broker that the house would be completely empty and ready for a private off-market showing by the end of next week. The broker asked a question I could not hear over the wind. Megan laughed sharply. She assured the broker that the primary resident, the miserable old man living in the basement, would not be a problem for the sale. She explicitly stated her master plan. She intended to sell the property quickly to an all-cash buyer, pocket the entire equity sum, and use a portion of those stolen funds to immediately commit me to a state-run lockdown memory care facility. She claimed she already had a private doctor on the payroll willing to sign the necessary commitment papers, declaring me a danger to myself and others. By locking me away behind fortified doors, she would permanently clear any potential title disputes and vanish with the cash long before the bank could officially initiate foreclosure on the massive second mortgage. She was planning to steal my home, steal my money, and completely steal my freedom in one swift, brutal motion. I stood on the top rung of the ladder, looking down at the sprawling property I had purchased with a lifetime of exhausting labor. Megan thought she was executing a flawless escape plan. She did not know the equity she planned to steal had already been legally vaporized by my hidden corporate lien. I quietly climbed down the ladder. I needed to move fast before her broker listed the house. I descended the aluminum extension ladder with methodical precision and stored it quietly in the dark corner of the garage. I knew exactly what my daughter-in-law was planning, and I knew my counterstrike required absolute flawless timing. The very next morning at 9 o'clock sharp, a sleek silver Mercedes pulled into the long driveway. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out holding a digital laser measuring device and a thick, genuine leather portfolio. Megan greeted him at the front door with an overly enthusiastic, highly practiced smile. She ushered him inside and eagerly offered him a comprehensive tour of the property. I stood at the bottom of the basement stairs, listening to the sharp, arrogant click of her designer heels against the bare hardwood floors above my head. She led the appraiser through the empty rooms, spinning a desperate, elaborate lie about minimalist aesthetics and preparing for a massive interior design overhaul. The heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs finally swung open. Megan led the appraiser down the wooden steps into the damp, unfinished basement. I was standing right by the furnace wearing my scuffed leather tool belt and wiping a heavy steel wrench with an old grease-stained rag. Megan did not even blink at the sight of me. She gestured toward me with a dismissive, insulting wave of her manicured hand and introduced me to the appraiser as the live-in maintenance man. She confidently claimed she allowed me to stay in the lower level out of pure charity in exchange for basic property upkeep and manual labor. The appraiser nodded slowly, completely disinterested in my presence. He raised his digital device, bouncing the bright red laser beam off the cold concrete walls to calculate the total square footage of the underground space. He lowered the device and scribbled a quick note in his leather portfolio. He turned to Megan and spoke with blunt, unwavering professional authority. He informed her that having an unauthorized lower-level tenant constituted a significant legal liability. He stated clearly that if she wanted to list the house on the luxury market and maximize her asking price, she needed to serve an immediate formal eviction notice and clear the basement entirely. Megan offered a sweet, reassuring laugh. She promised the appraiser that the miserable old maintenance man would be entirely removed from the premises by the end of the week. I did not react. I simply placed my wrench back into my tool belt and watched them walk back up the stairs. I waited exactly 5 minutes before following their footsteps up to the main floor. Megan and the luxury appraiser were standing right in the center of the kitchen. She was proudly pointing out the imported granite countertops and the custom mahogany cabinetry I had meticulously installed 3 years prior. I walked past them in complete silence and moved directly to the stainless steel coffee maker. Megan shot me a furious, silent warning glare, visibly demanding that I return to the basement immediately. I ignored her completely. I grabbed a heavy ceramic mug and slowly poured a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. I turned around and placed the steaming mug gently on the granite island, positioning it right next to the appraiser's open leather portfolio. As I pulled my hand back, I casually slid a thick, folded document out of my flannel shirt pocket and laid it flat on the smooth stone counter. It was a certified architectural and title survey, officially stamped by the county clerk just 24 hours earlier. The front page prominently displayed the property details, but the second page highlighted a massive, irrefutable legal reality in stark black ink. The document explicitly detailed the active senior lien held by my private limited liability company. It proved unequivocally that my corporation possessed the absolute first right of repossession and that the property could not be legally sold, transferred, leveraged, or evaluated without my direct notarized authorization. I did not say a single word. I simply picked up my own cup of coffee and leaned comfortably against the kitchen doorframe. The appraiser reached forward to take the mug I had poured him. His eyes naturally fell upon the official county-stamped document resting on the granite. He frowned, his professional curiosity taking over, and read the bold text. I watched the blood completely drain from his face in a matter of seconds. The color vanished from his cheeks, leaving a pale, sickly white hue. A high-end luxury real estate appraiser knows instantly when he is stepping into a disastrous legal minefield. He realized instantly that Megan was attempting to solicit a fraudulent valuation on a property she had absolutely no legal right to sell. He slammed his portfolio shut with a sharp, echoing crack. He did not say a single word to Megan. He practically ran down the hallway, pushed the front door open, and sprinted to his silver Mercedes. He backed out of the driveway so fast his tires squealed aggressively against the pavement. Megan stared at the open front door in absolute paralyzed disbelief. The heavy silence in the house hung thick and suffocating for 3 long seconds before she completely shattered it. She spun around to face me, her features twisted into a hideous mask of pure, unhinged fury. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding to know exactly what I had placed on the kitchen counter. She violently accused me of intentionally sabotaging her private appraisal and deliberately ruining her perfect opportunity to upgrade their lifestyle. She took a fast, threatening step toward me, raising her hand as if she fully intended to strike me across the face. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at her with the cold, detached, unflinching stare of a man watching a structural collapse happen in slow motion. Before she could close the physical distance between us, the front door violently burst open. The heavy wood slammed against the interior drywall with a deafening, violent crash. Devin stumbled forward into the foyer. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving up and down, sweat dripping down his pale forehead despite the crisp autumn air outside. His silk tie was loosened, his expensive tailored suit jacket was severely wrinkled, and his face was the color of dirty ash. He looked absolutely terrified, like a man staring directly at a ghost. Megan froze in her tracks, her burning anger instantly evaporating into sheer confusion at the sight of her husband's complete panic. Devin did not look at his wife. He did not look at me. He held his smartphone up high in the air with a violently shaking hand. The screen was illuminated brightly, displaying a stark red notification. He gasped for air, his voice cracking painfully as he finally forced the terrible words out of his throat. The bank had just officially frozen their primary joint checking account. They had completely locked down their credit lines, restricted their savings, and seized their emergency cash reserve. Devin choked back a miserable sob and announced that the bank's National Security Division had flagged their entire financial portfolio with a high-level catastrophic fraud alert. They had absolutely zero access to their money. The silent trap I had patiently anticipated was finally snapping shut right around their ankles. Devin stared at the glowing screen of his smartphone as if it were a live grenade. The bright red notification pulsed warning of a catastrophic high-level fraud alert. He looked up at Megan. His voice cracked as he demanded an immediate explanation. He told her the bank had entirely locked down their primary checking account and completely frozen their credit lines. He asked her exactly what she had done to trigger a national security flag. Megan backed away from the granite kitchen island, the arrogant facade she had worn for months shattered into a million jagged pieces. She stammered frantically, looking around the empty room for an escape route that did not exist. Devin closed the distance between them, his face pale with sheer terror. He demanded the truth. Cornered and trembling, Megan finally broke. The words spilled from her mouth in a pathetic, rushed confession. She admitted that the massive second mortgage was exactly 90 days past due. She confessed the predatory lending firm was hours away from initiating formal foreclosure proceedings against the property. To save her carefully curated affluent lifestyle, she had resorted to common desperate theft. She admitted she had sneaked into my room before the movers had arrived to strip the house. She dug through my personal belongings and stole a single blank check tied directly to my private retirement account. She carefully forged my signature on the bottom line. She wrote the check for exactly $40,000 and attempted to cash it that very morning to appease the ruthless lenders. Devin stepped back in absolute horror. He realized he was married to a felon. He realized his entire financial future was currently hanging by a thread because his wife had attempted to defraud his own father. Megan tried to reach for him, crying and begging for his understanding. She claimed she did it for their future, to protect the house, to maintain their pristine standing in the community. She insisted the bank would simply clear the administrative hold once they realized it was a simple family misunderstanding. She fundamentally misunderstood the severity of her actions. She believed a forged check was a minor inconvenience. She had no idea the trap she had blindly stepped into was crafted from hardened steel. A man who builds his wealth from the dirt up does not leave his vault unlocked. Surviving the brutal economic downturns of Detroit taught me that trust is earned, but security is mandatory. Decades ago, after a close call with a fraudulent contractor on a massive commercial build, I completely overhauled my financial infrastructure. I removed human error from the equation. I mandated a strict, unyielding dual biometric verification protocol for every single one of my private accounts. Any withdrawal, transfer, or check cashing attempt exceeding $500 required my physical presence, my fingerprint, and a secure digital authorization code. Megan had walked into a high-security bank branch with a piece of paper, completely ignorant of the invisible fortress surrounding my money. The moment the teller scanned the stolen check, the automated system rejected the transaction. The bank internal security network flagged the forgery instantly. The system did not just stop the transfer of the $40,000, it initiated a complete lockdown of the accounts associated with the fraudulent deposit attempt. The bank immediately dispatched an emergency alert directly to my private financial security team. My wealth manager called me within 60 seconds of Megan stepping away from the teller window. The $40,000 transaction was entirely dead before the ink on her forged signature had even dried. Megan stood in the empty living room, desperately trying to convince Devin that the situation was salvageable. She insisted that she could simply call the bank manager in the morning and smooth things over with a polite apology. She genuinely believed her status and her expensive clothes placed her above the rigid laws of financial fraud. She operated under the delusion that white-collar crime was easily forgivable if you lived in the right zip code. Devin ran his hands through his hair, pacing the bare hardwood floor. He knew the banking system did not care about apologies. He knew the frozen accounts meant their cars would be repossessed, their credit cards would be declined, and their curated life was effectively over. He looked at Megan with profound disgust, finally seeing the parasitic nature of the woman he had married. He realized the woman who had demanded my banishment to the basement was nothing more than a desperate, reckless thief. I stepped out of the hallway shadows and walked directly into the center of the kitchen. I held a thick, crisp manila folder in my right hand. I did not look at Megan. I addressed Devin directly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I pulled the official stamped bank fraud report from the folder and placed it flat on the granite counter. I told Devin that the Bank National Fraud Division had been fully prepared to involve federal authorities. They had compiled enough evidence to pursue immediate felony charges for wire fraud, identity theft, and check forgery. I watched Devin's eyes widen in sheer terror as he read the formal charges printed on the heavy stock paper. I informed him that I had personally intervened. I explicitly declined to press federal charges against his wife. I explained that I prefer to handle theft and betrayal internally without the messy public spectacle of a federal courtroom. I wanted them to face the consequences of their actions inside the very house they had tried to steal. Megan stared at the document, the horrific reality of her situation finally piercing her delusion. She realized she had narrowly escaped a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The sheer gravity of her crime threatened to crush her, but her panic rapidly morphed into a venomous, desperate survival instinct. She could not accept defeat. She reached out and grabbed Devin's arm, her fingernails digging sharply into his expensive suit jacket. She pulled him away from the kitchen island, placing her body between him and the fraud report. She whispered furiously, her voice trembling with manufactured conviction. She told Devin that the document was completely fake. She insisted that I was a bitter, senile old man who was actively hallucinating the entire forgery scenario to punish her for redecorating the living room. She pointed a shaking finger at my face and vehemently claimed that my mind was deteriorating rapidly. She desperately spun a new web of lies, insisting that my behavior had become an active danger to the household. She demanded that Devin stop listening to the ramblings of a sick man and take immediate medical action. She looked deep into his terrified eyes and delivered her final command. She told him that I had completely lost touch with reality and it was absolutely necessary to call Dr. Aris immediately. Devin was entirely paralyzed by the bank fraud report resting on the granite counter. He could not form a single rational thought as he stared at the frozen accounts that funded his entire existence. Megan seized the absolute opportunity to completely control the narrative. She snatched his smartphone from his trembling hand and dialed the direct number for her private concierge physician. She scheduled an emergency home visit under the very thin guise of examining her father's shoulder after his reckless demolition work in the garage. The next afternoon at exactly 1 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Dr. Aris stood on the front porch holding a vintage leather medical bag. He was a man who had built a highly lucrative private practice catering exclusively to the unsavory needs of affluent suburbanites. He was a known opportunist, famous in certain elite circles for signing rapid dementia diagnoses to help greedy heirs seize control of contested family assets without dealing with lengthy court battles. Megan did not lead the doctor to the master bedroom to check on her father. She steered him directly into the spacious kitchen where I was quietly eating my lunch. I sat at the granite island slicing a simple turkey sandwich. Megan placed a comforting hand on the doctor's arm and whispered loudly that my mental state had completely collapsed overnight. She claimed I was violently hallucinating forged checks and imaginary bank freezes. Dr. Aris stepped forward with a greasy, practiced smile. He placed his expensive bag on the counter and leaned far into my personal space. He began interrogating me with a sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone. He spoke slowly and loudly as if addressing a deaf toddler. He asked me what day of the week it was and wondered if I knew how to chew my food properly without assistance. His questions were entirely leading, designed specifically to document cognitive failure and justify an immediate lockdown. I continued chewing my food methodically, refusing to show any signs of intimidation. Dr. Aris pulled a small pen light from his pocket and flashed it directly into my eyes without asking for permission. He asked me if I knew who the current president was and if I remembered how to tie my own shoes. Megan stood behind him, nodding tragically and wiping a completely fake tear from her cheek. She was setting the stage to steal my freedom, and she needed this corrupt doctor to play his part perfectly. A man who has spent his entire life negotiating with hostile union bosses and corrupt city inspectors knows exactly how to identify a rigged game. I knew fighting his insulting interrogation would only fuel their manufactured narrative of elderly aggression. I decided to give them exactly the performance they so desperately craved. I allowed my broad shoulders to slump forward, intentionally adopting the weak posture of a defeated, broken man. I picked up my glass of ice water and intentionally loosened my grip, letting a highly convincing tremor rattle my hand. Cold water spilled over the rim and splashed onto the polished granite countertop. Megan let out a heavy, tragic sigh, covering her mouth to hide a bright, triumphant smile. Dr. Aris nodded sympathetically and pulled a sleek silver pen from his tailored suit jacket. He asked me to confirm the current year. I stared blankly at the stainless steel refrigerator for 10 long seconds before whispering a year that was exactly 1 decade in the past. The doctor's eyes gleamed with pure, unadulterated greed. He leaned closer, smelling strongly of expensive cologne, and asked me if I recognized my son Devin, who was hiding in the living room. I blinked, slowly furrowed my brow, and asked him who Devin was. I mumbled that my son was still a young boy playing in the backyard in Detroit. That was the final piece of bait. Dr. Aris did not draw blood. He did not perform a legitimate neurological scan. He eagerly pulled a crisp preliminary evaluation form from his leather bag. He confidently declared to Megan that I was suffering from advanced acute dementia and required immediate institutionalization for my own safety. He signed his name on the bottom line, officially declaring me mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. He stamped the document with his official medical seal, making the fraudulent diagnosis legally binding in the eyes of the state. He told Megan she now had the absolute authority to override any of my financial decisions and forcefully move me to a lockdown facility. He promised to send her the contact information for a private transport team that specialized in removing uncooperative elderly patients from their homes. He smiled at her, expecting his massive under-the-table bonus for delivering the exact result she had paid for. Megan practically vibrated with malicious excitement. That single-signed piece of paper was her golden ticket to absolute control over my entire estate and my permanent banishment to a state-run facility. She reached her manicured hand across the granite island to snatch the medical declaration. Before her fingers could even graze the document, I moved with a sudden fluid speed that completely shattered my fragile old man facade. I snatched the paper out of her reach and pinned it firmly under my left elbow. My hand tremor vanished instantly. I sat up perfectly straight and looked directly into the doctor's widening eyes. I reached into the inner pocket of my flannel shirt and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. I handed it directly to Dr. Aris. He took it with a confused frown and tore open the flap. Inside was a pristine, heavily detailed and official psychological evaluation. It was explicitly time-stamped from 8:00 that very morning. I had paid a private visit to the most respected state board-certified neurologist in the entire region. The comprehensive report definitively proved my cognitive function was flawless and operating in the top percentile for my age bracket. Attached directly behind that unassailable medical clearance was a fully drafted medical malpractice and fraud lawsuit prepared by my attorney, Mr. Hayes. The legal document bore Dr. Aris's full name and detailed his extensive history of facilitating fraudulent asset seizures. I politely informed the doctor that if he did not leave my property immediately, I would file the injunction and ensure his medical license was permanently revoked by sunset. The blood drained completely from his face. He dropped his silver pen onto the counter, turned sharply on his heel, and sprinted out the front door. He did not even bother to grab his expensive vintage leather medical bag. His luxury car tires squealed against the asphalt as he abandoned Megan to her fate. Megan stood frozen in the kitchen, realizing her final desperate attempt to escape prison had just evaporated. She looked at the time-stamped neurological evaluation resting on the granite counter and knew she possessed absolutely zero leverage. I calmly picked up my glass of water and took a slow, steady sip. I informed her that the walls were finally closing in and there were no more emergency exits left to take. Megan snatched the preliminary evaluation form from the granite counter the exact moment Dr. Aris sprinted out the front door. Her desperation completely blinded her to the reality of the situation. She convinced herself that the piece of paper bearing his hurried signature and medical seal was her undisputed golden ticket. She completely ignored the certified neurological evaluation and the drafted malpractice lawsuit I had presented. Delusion is an incredibly powerful narcotic, and Megan drank it down to the very dregs. She truly believed she had won the war and secured the absolute legal authority to seize my assets and banish me to a state lockdown facility. To celebrate her perceived victory and the imminent, highly profitable sale of the property, she organized a lavish dinner party for her elite social circle. She wanted to display her absolute dominance and humiliate me one final time before casting me out into the cold. She marched into my bedroom the following afternoon and threw a cheap, ill-fitting polyester blazer directly onto my bed. She ordered me to put it on immediately. She explicitly commanded me to act as the evening service staff for her guests. She wanted the architect of her impending ruin to pour wine in clear porcelain plates for her snobby, ungrateful friends. I did not argue or raise my voice. I simply slipped my arms into the tight, restrictive sleeves and fastened the single plastic button. I walked into the dining room where the long, custom mahogany table I had built had been replaced by a rented, fragile glass monstrosity. Megan and Devin were already seated with 10 of their affluent, superficial colleagues. Devin looked completely hollow and broken. The massive bank fraud alert was still crushing his spirit, but Megan acted as though they had just won the state lottery. She rang a tiny silver bell to command my immediate attention. She pointed a manicured finger to a row of expensive Bordeaux bottles resting on a side table. She loudly instructed me to open the first bottle and begin pouring for her important guests. She spoke to me as if I were a mindless, indentured servant. I picked up the heavy glass bottle and smoothly inserted the corkscrew. I knew exactly what I was doing. I was playing my assigned role perfectly while the invisible noose tightened firmly around her neck. I moved around the large glass table with methodical, flawless precision, pouring the expensive vintage Bordeaux into delicate crystal goblets without spilling a single drop. The guests engaged in loud, pretentious conversations about robust stock portfolios, luxury vacations, and exclusive private country clubs. I remained completely invisible to them as I carefully filled their glasses. I reached the head of the table and began pouring for a man wearing a tailored, imported suit and an expensive silver watch. He paused his conversation and looked up at me with genuine, mild curiosity. He clearly noticed the stark visual contrast between my calloused, heavily scarred hands and the delicate, fragile crystal I was holding. He leaned back in his chair and politely asked what I did for a living before I reached retirement age. Before I could even open my mouth to formulate an answer, Megan quickly interrupted. She let out a sharp, patronizing laugh that easily cut through the ambient chatter of the dining room. She spoke loudly and forcefully, ensuring every single guest at the table turned their attention directly toward us. She told the man not to bother asking me complicated questions because my memory was fading exceptionally fast. She boldly claimed that I was just a simple, uneducated blue-collar laborer who had spent 40 miserable years hammering nails for minimum wage. She stated that my mind was completely gone and she was currently forced to provide me with constant adult supervision out of the absolute goodness of her heart. She painted herself as a gracious saint burdened by an incompetent, senile relative. The entire table erupted into polite, stifled laughter. Several wealthy guests cast pitiful, condescending glances in my direction. Devin kept his eyes locked firmly on his dinner plate, entirely too terrified to correct his wife. Megan smiled radiantly, soaking up the sympathetic attention of her peers. She truly believed she had successfully and completely degraded me in front of her high society audience. I did not flinch or look away. I finished pouring the dark red wine into the guest's glass. I stepped back from the table and pulled the white linen service napkin from my forearm. I walked directly over to the exact center of the table and placed the heavy glass wine bottle down onto the flat surface. I set it down with a firm, resounding thud that instantly silenced the laughter and drew every single eye in the room directly to me. I stood perfectly straight, shrugging off the restrictive tension of the cheap polyester blazer. I looked directly at the wealthy man who had politely asked about my career. I introduced myself clearly and formally using my full legal name. I informed the table that I did not just hammer nails for a meager hourly wage. I calmly explained that I founded, owned, and operated the largest commercial union construction firm in the entire state of Michigan. I methodically listed the major downtown structural developments my company had built from the dirt up. I named the towering commercial high-rises, the sprawling medical research complexes, and the massive luxury residential developments that these very guests likely invested their own money in. I explained that I managed hundreds of skilled union workers and personally negotiated multi-million-dollar municipal contracts for over 4 decades. I was the absolute, undisputed architect of the city skyline they admired every single day. The arrogant, condescending smirks completely vanished from their faces. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the dining room as the guests finally realized they were sitting in the presence of a legitimate, self-made financial titan. Megan's jaw dropped open in pure shock. Her carefully constructed narrative of the senile, helpless laborer instantly shattered into worthless dust. I did not break eye contact with her. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my blazer and pulled out a thick, certified legal letter. I walked around the glass table and dropped the heavy envelope directly onto Megan's pristine porcelain dinner plate. I informed her that the document contained an urgent, critical update regarding her fraudulent second mortgage. I explicitly explained that the predatory lending firm she owed $40,000 to had officially declined to initiate standard foreclosure proceedings. Instead, they had bundled and sold her entire defaulted debt portfolio to a highly aggressive, ruthless private equity firm. I watched the blood completely drain from Devin's face as he instantly grasped the catastrophic financial implications. Private equity firms do not negotiate terms, and they do not offer friendly extensions. They liquidate assets with ruthless, absolute precision. Megan stared down at the certified letter in pure, unadulterated horror. She did not know that the private holding company that now completely owned her crushing debt was entirely controlled by me. Devin ripped the heavy parchment from Megan's trembling hands. His eyes darted rapidly across the bold legal typeface. The private equity firm was not merely assuming the massive debt. They were executing a highly aggressive acceleration clause buried deep within the original predatory contract. The entire principal plus exorbitant penalty fees was demanded in full within 48 hours. The certified letter explicitly stated that all standard municipal foreclosure grace periods were completely bypassed due to a commercial leverage loophole Megan had blindly agreed to. Devin slumped against the edge of the rented glass dining table. The sheer magnitude of his absolute financial ruin crushed the breath directly out of his lungs. He stared at the floor, realizing his credit, his career, and his meticulously curated suburban kingdom were completely obliterated. Megan did not offer him a single shred of comfort. The sudden horrifying realization that she was about to lose her luxury status ignited a ferocious, vicious rage. She turned on her husband like a cornered wild animal. She screamed at Devin right in front of her affluent peers. She loudly blamed his utter incompetence for allowing their finances to reach this catastrophic breaking point. She accused him of being a weak, pathetic failure who could not even protect his own household from a simple bank error. Her shrill voice echoed off the bare walls, amplifying her unhinged fury. The wealthy guests who had been mocking me just moments prior suddenly found themselves trapped in the epicenter of a brutal domestic collapse. The tailored man who had politely asked about my career slowly placed his crystal wine goblet down on the glass table. He did not say a word. He simply turned and walked swiftly toward the foyer. The rest of the dinner party immediately followed suit. They grabbed their expensive cashmere coats and designer handbags, fleeing the house as fast as their legs could carry them. They completely abandoned Megan and Devin to the miserable ruins of their own making. I did not stay to watch the rest of their explosive argument. I turned my back on the screaming match, stepped out of the dining room, and walked quietly down the hall to the basement stairs. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, sealing away the chaos I had carefully engineered. I descended the wooden stairs and returned to my small, quiet corner near the furnace. The basement felt peaceful, a sanctuary entirely isolated from the financial slaughter occurring on the main floor. 10 minutes later, the heavy basement door swung open. Frantic footsteps pounded heavily down the wooden stairs. Devin stumbled into the dim light. His silk designer tie was completely undone, and his face was streaked with desperate, cowardly tears. He did not possess the arrogant posture he had displayed when Megan stripped the television remote control from my hand. He collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, dropping directly to his knees. He grabbed the hem of my flannel shirt and begged me to save him. He pleaded with me to contact my bank and unlock my retirement savings to pay off the ruthless equity firm. He cried openly, sobbing about his future, his ruined credit, and the absolute destruction of his marriage. He swore he would pay me back every single cent if I just bailed him out of this catastrophic mess. I stood perfectly still. I looked down at the boy I had raised with absolute cold detachment. A father's love is unconditional, but respect must be heavily earned. I pulled my shirt from his desperate grip and took a calculated step backward. I looked him directly in the eyes and explained the harsh, unyielding reality of my financial structure. I told him that my massive union pension, my commercial investments, and my liquid assets were entirely inaccessible to me. When I realized the true malicious intent of his wife and his own spineless complicity, I had proactively restructured my entire estate. I had legally locked every single dollar inside an ironclad, irrevocable blind trust. I explained that the trust was managed by an independent third-party fiduciary who was legally bound to reject any withdrawal requests made under duress or family manipulation. I told Devin that even if I possessed the desire to save his fragile suburban kingdom from the private equity firm, I legally could not produce a single dime. The utter finality of my words struck him like a physical blow. He buried his face in his hands and wept against the cold concrete, realizing he was entirely on his own. Megan absolutely refused to accept her sudden, devastating poverty. Surrender was not a concept she understood or tolerated. The following morning, she formulated a desperate, aggressive plan to save her luxurious lifestyle. She spent 2 hours meticulously preparing her appearance. She dressed in her most expensive tailored power suit. She applied flawless makeup and styled her hair to project absolute confidence and undeniable wealth. She intended to march directly into the downtown headquarters of the ruthless private equity firm that now held her debt. She planned to utilize every single weapon in her arsenal. She fully intended to negotiate fiercely threatened legal action or seduce her way out of the crushing $40,000 obligation. She drove her leased silver Mercedes into the heart of the city and parked in front of a towering, sleek glass skyscraper. She rode the high-speed elevator directly to the top-floor penthouse suite. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of polished black marble and brushed steel. Megan bypassed the front desk entirely, ignoring the secretary's loud protests. She marched down the executive hallway, fueled by pure, unadulterated entitlement. She reached the heavy frosted glass doors of the chief executive officer. She did not bother to knock or announce her presence. She pushed the heavy glass doors open with a sharp, aggressive shove, ready to unleash her carefully rehearsed manipulative demands. She stepped into the vast corner office and froze completely. The expensive designer handbag slipped from her fingers and crashed heavily onto the hardwood floor. The grand corner office offered a panoramic view of the massive downtown developments I had proudly built from the dirt up. Resting in the exact center of the room was a massive custom mahogany desk I had crafted with my own 2 hands. I was sitting comfortably behind that mahogany desk. I was no longer wearing the scuffed leather tool belt or the cheap polyester blazer she had forced upon me. I was wearing a bespoke midnight blue suit perfectly tailored to my broad shoulders. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, laced my fingers together, and offered my daughter-in-law a cold, welcoming smile. Megan stood absolutely paralyzed in the doorway of the executive suite. The heavy frosted glass door swung shut behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss, severing her connection to the outside world. She stared at me, sitting comfortably behind the massive custom mahogany desk, her eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending terror. Her expensive designer handbag remained on the polished hardwood floor where it had fallen, spilling its contents in a chaotic mess. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat produced nothing more than a ragged, shallow gasp. She had marched into this building fully expecting to manipulate a faceless corporate executive. Instead, she found the man she had banished to a damp basement. I did not offer her a seat. I maintained my relaxed posture, laced my fingers together, and formally introduced myself. I stated clearly that I was the founder, chief executive officer, and majority shareholder of the private equity firm that now completely controlled her financial destiny. I watched her mind desperately try to reject the reality unfolding right in front of her. She stammered out a weak, pathetic denial, insisting that I was just a retired union carpenter from Detroit. I nodded slowly, confirming that I indeed spent 40 years working with my hands. However, a man who understands the structural integrity of a high-rise building also understands the compounding power of aggressive financial planning. I calmly provided her with the missing pieces of my history. I explained that for 3 decades, while my peers spent their wages on fleeting comforts, I quietly funneled every spare dollar of my union pension and overtime pay into highly volatile, incredibly lucrative investment portfolios. I utilized my deep insider knowledge of municipal zoning and commercial real estate to predict market shifts before they ever happened. My capital multiplied exponentially in the shadows. 10 years ago, when the market crashed, I purchased this private equity firm outright for pennies on the dollar. I transformed it into a financial fortress. I built an empire, silently choosing to live a modest blue-collar life because true power never requires an audience. Megan gripped the edge of a leather guest chair, her knuckles turning bone white as the horrific truth finally crushed her manufactured reality. She was completely at my mercy. I unclasped my hands and reached for the thick black leather binder resting on the corner of my desk. I flipped it open with a sharp, decisive motion. I told Megan that private equity firms do not operate on emotion or pity. We operate strictly on irrefutable documented facts. I pulled out a high-resolution, color-printed copy of the blank check she had stolen from my private retirement account. I slid it across the smooth mahogany surface until it stopped directly in front of her. The forged signature glared back at her in stark black ink. I reminded her that bank fraud carrying a $40,000 threshold is a federal felony carrying mandatory minimum sentencing. I then pulled out a stack of glossy 8x10 photographs. I laid them out in a neat chronological row next to the check. The images clearly depicted the catastrophic structural damage her unlicensed father had caused in the garage when he illegally removed a load-bearing column. I informed her that those photographs had already been submitted to the municipal building inspector and the property insurance underwriter. Her father was currently facing massive civil liabilities and potential criminal negligence charges for endangering the structural integrity of the home. Megan began to shake violently. She tried to deny the allegations, frantically claiming that I had misunderstood her intentions and that she always respected my position in the family. I did not let her finish her pathetic lie. I picked up a small digital audio recorder from my desk drawer and pressed the play button. The crystal-clear audio filled the executive suite. Megan's own shrill, arrogant voice echoed off the glass walls, explicitly telling her luxury real estate broker that she planned to sell the house out from under me. The recording vividly captured her calling me a miserable old grunt and detailing her malicious strategy to commit me to a lockdown memory care facility. I stopped the recording and dropped the device onto the desk. I dismantled her entire false reality piece by heavy piece. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and stated the absolute, unvarnished truth. She had zero leverage, zero escape routes, and absolutely no power left to wield. She was a petty thief standing in the epicenter of a financial empire she could not even comprehend. The suffocating weight of absolute defeat finally broke through Megan's polished corporate exterior. The panic in her eyes instantly morphed into a feral, cornered rage. She bared her teeth in a vicious snarl, entirely dropping the pathetic facade of a misunderstood daughter-in-law. She slammed her hands down onto the mahogany desk, leaning forward with pure venom radiating from her face. She declared fiercely that she absolutely refused to go down alone. She shrieked that she would leave this office immediately, hire the most ruthless divorce attorney in the city, and completely decimate Devon in court. She threatened to legally demand half of everything they owned. She boldly claimed she would force the immediate sale of the property, take her 50% of the massive house equity in a lump sum settlement, and start a brand new life far away from my miserable family. She confidently assumed the sprawling suburban estate was her ultimate safety net. I let her finish her frantic, screaming tirade. I did not blink or break eye contact. I reached into the very back of the leather binder and extracted one final legally notarized document. I pushed the heavy parchment across the desk, placing it directly over her stolen check. I calmly instructed her to read the highlighted financial summary. I explained that she could certainly divorce Devon and demand her legal 50% of the marital estate. However, the sprawling house she valued so highly currently held absolutely zero equity. I reminded her of the architectural survey I had dropped on the kitchen counter days earlier. My private holding company held a senior ironclad corporate lien against the property that completely vaporized any remaining value. The house was financially underwater. I watched her eyes dart across the balance sheet as the ultimate trap snapped shut around her neck. By filing for a divorce, she would not be walking away with half of a fortune. She would be legally assuming exactly half of their catastrophic marital debt. I pointed a steady finger at the final red number printed at the bottom of the page. I informed her that if she walked out of my office and filed those divorce papers, she would personally owe my private equity firm exactly $400,000. I leaned back in my chair and invited her to make her next move. Megan practically kicked the heavy frosted glass doors of my downtown office open on her way out. She sprinted to her silver Mercedes and sped back to the suburbs in a state of absolute unhinged panic. When she violently jerked her car into the long driveway of the estate, she was immediately confronted by another massive problem. Her younger brother was leaning casually against the hood of a leased bright red sports car. He was a notorious opportunist who specialized in pitching fraudulent, non-existent tech startups to gullible investors. He had spent the last 2 years successfully draining Devin and Megan's accounts to fund his lavish, parasitic lifestyle. He marched directly up to Megan the second she stepped out of her vehicle. He loudly demanded his next scheduled cash injection, claiming his software development team was threatening to walk out and ruin his massive launch. Devin walked out of the front door looking pale and completely defeated. He descended the porch steps and informed his brother-in-law that the bank accounts were completely frozen. He confessed that there was absolutely no money left to fund any more imaginary corporate ventures. Megan's brother did not handle financial rejection well. His arrogant smirk instantly dissolved into a mask of aggressive physical rage. He took 2 fast steps forward and violently grabbed Devin by the lapels of his wrinkled dress shirt. He slammed Devin backward against the side of the Mercedes, denting the expensive silver quarter panel. He screamed that he had hard deadlines and legally binding vendor contracts to fulfill. He demanded that Devin stop making pathetic excuses and immediately transfer the promised capital. Devin raised his hands in a weak, submissive gesture, entirely incapable of defending himself against the sudden physical assault. Megan stood frozen on the driveway. Watching her own brother physically brutalize her husband over stolen funds she could no longer provide. A violent, chaotic altercation brewed directly on the manicured front lawn of the property I legally owned. I watched the entire pathetic display unfold from the large bay window on the first floor. It was time to permanently sever the final parasitic cord attached to my estate. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and calmly stepped outside into the crisp, biting afternoon air, ready to end this. I stepped out onto the front porch and let the heavy oak door click firmly shut behind me. The sharp sound echoed across the driveway, instantly drawing the attention of the 2 struggling men. I walked down the concrete steps with slow, deliberate precision. I did not raise my voice or rush my movements. I approached Megan's brother and calmly instructed him to release his grip on my son's collar. He sneered at me, tightening his fists, completely unaware of the absolute destruction I was holding in my left hand. I did not ask him a second time. I simply raised a thick blue legal folder and pressed it directly against his chest. Instinctively, he released Devin to grab the heavy file before it fell to the concrete. I instructed him to open it and review the top page. It was a printed, highlighted copy of federal wire fraud statutes, specifically detailing the severe mandatory sentencing guidelines for receiving and laundering stolen corporate funds. Underneath that statute was a comprehensive stack of certified bank tracing documents. I explicitly explained to him that the tens of thousands of dollars he had previously bullied out of Devin and Megan did not come from their personal savings. I revealed that those funds were systematically siphoned from a legally protected, federally insured pension trust that I exclusively controlled. I watched his aggressive posture completely evaporate as his eyes scanned the undeniable hard-printed evidence of his financial crimes. I informed him that my forensic accountants had successfully traced every single fraudulent transfer directly into his personal checking accounts. He swallowed hard, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as the full weight of the documentation pressed down on him. He tried to stammer a pathetic defense, claiming he had absolutely no idea the investment capital was stolen from a protected pension fund. I looked him dead in the eyes and delivered the final, crushing blow. I calmly informed him that the Federal Bureau of Investigation views willful ignorance of stolen funds as direct prosecutable complicity. I explained that accepting and spending stolen money carried the exact same federal prison sentence as the original theft. He was holding irrefutable proof of his own criminal liability, and he finally understood that his fake technology startup was about to become the center of a massive federal investigation. Megan's brother stared at the federal wire fraud statutes with wide, terrified eyes. The sheer reality of facing 10 consecutive years in a maximum security federal prison completely shattered his arrogant facade. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale under the bright afternoon sun. He dropped the heavy blue folder onto the concrete driveway as if the paper itself were actively burning his bare hands. He did not say a single word to me. He did not ask Devin for another dime. He turned his back on his sister, scrambled frantically into the driver's seat of his leased red sports car, and slammed the door shut. He started the engine with a desperate roaring rumble and threw the transmission into reverse. As he accelerated backward out of the long driveway, I watched him reach for his smartphone mounted on the dashboard. He was aggressively blocking Megan's phone number before his tires even hit the main suburban street. He sped away, abandoning his family to save his own skin. Devin slumped against the side of the silver Mercedes, clutching his chest and taking deep, ragged breaths. Megan stood completely paralyzed on the pavement, watching her ultimate safety net vanish into the distance. She was now entirely isolated, financially ruined, and legally trapped. I turned my gaze away from the driveway and looked up toward the second floor of the house. The thick curtains of the guest bedroom window shifted slightly. Megan's parents had been silently watching the entire violent exchange from the safety of the upper level. They had witnessed the irrefutable proof of their daughter's massive financial crimes and the swift, brutal collapse of her fraudulent empire. They knew my private equity firm now controlled the property, and they understood they were currently squatting in a house legally owned by the man they had actively tried to destroy. They did not come downstairs to defend their daughter. They did not offer Devin any assistance. They quietly stepped back from the glass and let the curtains fall shut. Within 15 minutes, they had frantically packed their expensive suitcases. They bypassed the grand foyer, entirely slipping quietly out the back patio door and vanishing into the gathering shadows of the evening. They abandoned their daughter to the absolute ruins of her own making. The cold light of dawn breached the expansive living room windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the imported hardwood floors. The sprawling suburban estate was entirely stripped of its former artificial warmth. The luxurious dinner party had evaporated. Her opportunistic brother had fled the premises, and her own parents had vanished into the darkness like cowards. The house was completely empty of guests and devoid of any remaining allies. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the property, amplifying the absolute ruin that now surrounded them. Megan had not slept a single minute. She paced the length of the living room like a trapped feral animal, frantically searching for a weak point in a steel cage. Her immaculate power suit was severely wrinkled, and her carefully styled hair hung in disheveled strands around her pale face. She stopped pacing and turned her frantic gaze toward Devin. He was still sitting on the edge of the plush leather sofa, staring blankly at the floorboards, entirely paralyzed by the crushing weight of his catastrophic financial collapse. Megan did not offer him a single word of comfort or solidarity. The instinct for self-preservation completely overrode her marital vows. She marched over to him and kicked the leg of the coffee table to shatter his catatonic trance. She ordered him to stand up and immediately list his luxury sports car for a rapid cash sale. She demanded he extract whatever depreciated equity remained in the vehicle and hand the funds directly to her. She explicitly stated she needed a first-class plane ticket out of the state by the afternoon. She wanted to run as far away from the private equity firm and my ironclad legal traps as possible. She commanded him to liquidate his prized possessions so she could escape the blast radius of his monumental failure. Devin slowly raised his head, blinking as if waking from a severe concussion. He looked at the woman he had catered to, the woman for whom he had betrayed his own father, and finally registered the absolute emptiness in her eyes. She pointed a trembling finger toward the driveway, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. She laid out a delusional survival plan where she would establish residence across the country, while he remained behind to absorb the legal fallout of the massive debt. She genuinely believed her presence in his life had been a premium service, and now that his financial utility had officially expired, her subscription was permanently canceled. She stood over him, tapping her foot impatiently, waiting for the obedient, subservient husband to execute her escape strategy. Devin remained seated on the leather sofa, his hands resting heavily on his knees. For the first time in their entire marriage, he did not immediately scramble to fulfill her outrageous demands. The blinding fog of his desperate affection finally lifted, completely exposing Megan's true parasitic nature. He saw her not as a partner, but as a ruthless, emotional mercenary who had systematically extracted his wealth, alienated his family, and driven him into an insurmountable financial abyss. He quietly informed her that he would not sell the vehicle. He stated with absolute, uncharacteristic firmness that he would not fund her cowardice. Devin slowly stood up, finally matching her eye level. He reminded her that she could not simply abandon the wreckage. He pointed out that they were legally married, and the crushing $400,000 penalty imposed by my private equity firm was a shared marital burden. He told her she was equally bound to the catastrophic debt and would face the exact same asset seizures, wage garnishments, and permanent credit destruction. Megan's expression shifted from frantic desperation to cold, calculated amusement. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that completely chilled the air in the living room. She shook her head with deep, condescending pity. She informed Devon that he was, as always, hopelessly naive and entirely several steps behind. She casually adjusted the cuffs of her wrinkled blazer and delivered her final devastating strike. Megan revealed that she had secretly filed binding legal separation papers establishing entirely separate finances exactly 3 months ago. She coldly explained the strategic architecture of her recent behavioral shifts. When Devon's commercial real estate ventures first began showing minor signs of instability last quarter, she immediately retained a ruthless private attorney. She had covertly transferred her personal assets into offshore holding accounts and legally severed her financial liability from his failing corporate profile. She smiled a wicked, triumphant smile. She clarified that because the fraudulent second mortgage and the catastrophic acceleration clause were signed strictly under his corporate LLC, he was solely and entirely responsible for the impending ruin. She was legally untouchable. She grabbed her designer coat from the back of an armchair, thanked him for the temporary luxury lifestyle, and advised him to start packing his bags before my collection agents arrived to seize the furniture. The front door slammed shut, severing Devon's marriage and his reality in a single violent motion. A blind, suffocating panic surged through his veins. He was completely isolated, facing $500,000 in immediate unpayable debt, and his legal shield had just evaporated. The primal urge to flee finally eclipsed his paralyzing despair. He spun around and sprinted frantically up the grand curved staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. His heavy footsteps echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings of the empty mansion. He dashed down the long hallway and tore open the door to his expansive master suite. He bypassed the expensive designer luggage and went directly toward the custom walk-in closet. Hidden behind a row of tailored Italian suits was a flush biometric wall safe. It was his ultimate contingency plan. Over the past 5 years, he had quietly siphoned thousands of dollars in untraceable cash from his various municipal construction bids, hiding it away for an emergency exactly like this one. He also kept his international passport, his secondary identity documents, and a collection of high-value, untraceable gold bullion secured within the reinforced steel box. His hands shook violently as he keyed in the complex numerical sequence and pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner. The heavy internal locking mechanism disengaged with a solid metallic click. Devon grabbed the cold steel handle and yanked the heavy door open, desperately anticipating the sight of his stacked financial salvation. He stared into the dark, recessed cavity. His breathing stopped entirely. The thick stacks of emergency currency were gone. The heavy gold bullion had vanished. His international passport and his secondary identification documents were completely missing. The reinforced steel safe was entirely barren, thoroughly stripped of every single asset he required to launch a new life and escape the jurisdiction of the federal authorities. Resting precisely in the center of the cold metal shelf was a single crisp piece of white stationery. Devon reached in with a trembling hand and picked up the paper. His eyes darted across the page, recognizing the sharp, methodical handwriting instantly. It was the same precise penmanship that had drafted his childhood birthday cards and signed his early business loans. There was no lengthy explanation, no emotional farewell, and no list of arrogant demands. The note contained only 3 deeply chilling words written in bold black ink. Check the basement. Devon practically threw himself down the wooden stairs, his polished dress shoes slipping dangerously on the worn treads. He burst into the basement, his lungs burning and his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated panic. I was waiting for him. I sat comfortably in the vintage custom leather armchair that Megan had arrogantly banished to the dampest corner of the storage room months ago. Resting precisely on the small wooden side table beside me was the thick stack of banded emergency currency and his navy blue international passport. Devon stared at the items, his chest heaving as the reality of my absolute control finally shattered his remaining psychological defenses. He crossed the concrete floor and collapsed heavily at my feet. The arrogant, posturing executive who had stood silently by while I was degraded in my own home completely vanished, replaced by a terrified child. He grabbed my knees and began to weep with loud, pathetic gasps. He begged me for a final bailout, swearing on his life that he would change his behavior and make entirely different choices moving forward. He wildly pointed his finger toward the ceiling, pushing the entirety of the blame onto Megan. He claimed her relentless greed and toxic manipulation had forced his hand, arguing that he was merely a victim of her ruthless social climbing. He pleaded for the passport and the cash, promising to disappear and rebuild his life far away from the catastrophic commercial debt she had orchestrated. He swore he never wanted to hurt me, and that every abusive action was a direct result of her unhinged demands. I listened to his frantic, pathetic excuses without shifting my posture. His tears pooled on the concrete floor, a physical manifestation of his utter cowardice. He believed he could sever his complicity by simply pointing a finger at his fleeing wife. He desperately hoped the fatherly instinct to protect a son would override the cold, hard logic of the situation. I looked down at the weeping man clinging to my trousers, feeling absolutely no pity. I reached over to the wooden side table and picked up a heavy, leather-bound ledger. The time for blind parental bailouts had officially concluded. I opened the thick leather cover of the ledger and smoothed the heavy parchment pages. I did not raise my voice or display a single ounce of anger. I looked directly into Devon's bloodshot eyes and began to read aloud the exact mathematical cost of his weakness. I read the precise dates and the specific dollar amounts of the protected pension funds he had cowardly funneled into his brother-in-law's fraudulent tech startup. I listed the exorbitant secondary mortgage fees he had signed off on to fund Megan's superficial kitchen renovations, completely destroying the equity of the home I had built for our family. I methodically calculated the sheer financial destruction his absolute lack of a spine had caused, down to the final decimal point. Beyond the raw numbers, I cataloged his profound moral bankruptcy. I reminded him of the quiet Tuesday afternoon when Megan threw a cheap polyester blazer at me and ordered me to serve wine to his arrogant colleagues. I detailed the exact moment he stared down at his pristine porcelain dinner plate, choosing to silently chew his food while his wife falsely declared me a senile, incompetent laborer. I explained that a man who allows his father to be degraded in his own home to preserve a fragile social facade is a man entirely devoid of worth. Devon sobbed louder, reaching desperately for the passport resting on the table. I moved my hand and pulled the document entirely out of his reach. I told him that an architect measures the integrity of a structure by how it handles immense pressure. When the pressure was applied to him, he instantly crumbled, sacrificing his own blood to appease a parasite. I closed the heavy leather ledger with a sharp, resounding thud that echoed off the bare concrete walls. I leaned forward and looked at him with absolute detachment. I informed him that I would not release a single cent of the emergency funds. I told him the passport and the cash would remain securely in my possession. I refused to finance his cowardly escape from a financial disaster he had actively helped engineer. He was going to remain exactly where he was and absorb the full devastating impact of his choices. Devon let out a gut-wrenching wail and collapsed fully onto the cold concrete floor. He curled his body into a tight, trembling ball, sobbing uncontrollably as the inescapable reality of his situation completely smothered him. The ruthless private equity firm was demanding an immediate, unpayable fortune. His wife had legally severed their finances and abandoned him to the wreckage. His hidden emergency escape funds were confiscated by the very man he had tried to throw into a state lockdown facility. He was entirely trapped, stripped of every single shield he had cowardly hidden behind. I sat in the leather armchair and watched him weep, offering zero absolution. The heavy, suffocating silence of the basement was suddenly shattered by a series of loud, authoritative knocks echoing heavily from the front door upstairs. The aggressive pounding reverberated through the hardwood floorboards, signaling the absolute end of the line. I calmly stood up from the armchair, leaving Devon sobbing pitifully in the shadows. I walked to the wooden stairs and ascended to the main level with slow, deliberate footsteps. I moved through the expansive empty foyer and reached the heavy oak front door. I turned the brass handle and pulled the door open to the crisp afternoon air. 2 armed sheriff's deputies were standing squarely on the front porch. Their dark uniforms were sharply pressed and their heavy-duty equipment belts gleamed in the sunlight. The lead deputy held a thick stack of official court-stamped documents tightly in his right hand. He looked past me into the empty foyer before asking to speak directly with Devon and Megan. I remained standing in the doorway and calmly informed the officers that Megan had already fled the premises. I confirmed that Devon was currently incapacitated in the basement. The lead deputy nodded sharply and held up the heavy stack of paperwork. He stated in a firm, unwavering voice that he was executing an immediate, unappealable property seizure. He presented the finalized eviction notices authorized by the municipal court judge. The absolute final grace period for the catastrophic commercial debt had officially expired. The deputies demanded that the property be completely vacated and surrendered to the private equity firm before the sun went down. The lead deputy stepped over the threshold, his heavy black boots echoing sharply against the polished hardwood of the grand foyer. He bypassed my quiet, observant presence entirely and focused his authoritative gaze directly on Devon, who had just dragged his defeated body up from the dark basement. Megan burst through the front door a mere second later. She had seen the flashing blue and red patrol lights illuminating the driveway from where she had been standing, paralyzed by her brother's sudden departure. She marched into the foyer, demanding immediate answers, still desperately clinging to the fragile, shattered illusion of her supreme authority. The deputy did not indulge her arrogant high society posturing. He unrolled the court-stamped eviction order, the crisp paper crackling in the tense silence of the room. He read the absolute final judgment aloud, formally informing Devon and Megan that their legal occupancy of the sprawling estate had completely terminated. He stated with unyielding bureaucratic coldness that they possessed exactly 30 minutes to gather their immediate personal belongings and permanently vacate the premises. The sheer, uncompromising finality of his rigid words struck Megan like a physical blow to the chest. Her meticulously crafted corporate facade instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. She simply could not comprehend that her wealth, her elite status, and her shelter were being forcibly stripped away by armed officers of the law. The creeping panic rapidly mutated into a blind, feral, and completely unhinged hysteria. She began screaming at the absolute top of her lungs, unleashing a torrent of vicious, venomous insults at the stoic deputies, at her trembling husband, and at the unforgiving reality of her situation. Her voice cracked and broke as she vehemently denied the legality of the eviction, demanding to speak to the chief of police and threatening to unleash massive federal lawsuits against my private equity firm. When the deputies remained perfectly unmoved by her frantic theatrical performance, her boiling rage tipped over into destructive physical violence. She spun around and grabbed a heavy hand-painted ceramic vase resting on the entryway console table. With a guttural shriek of pure, unadulterated fury, she hurled the expensive artifact directly across the foyer. The ceramic projectile sailed through the air and smashed violently against the pristine drywall. It exploded into countless sharp fragments, raining jagged shards of pottery and stagnant, murky flower water all over the expensive imported rug. The deafening crash echoed throughout the expansive house, serving as a violent exclamation point to the absolute end of her luxurious suburban reign. The lead deputy did not flinch, blink, or take a single step backward when the heavy ceramic vase shattered violently against the wall. He smoothly rested his right hand over his shoulder-mounted radio and dropped his left hand directly onto the heavy, black utility belt resting at his waist. He stepped forward, purposely closing the physical distance between himself and the hysterical, screaming woman. He locked his stern eyes directly onto hers and spoke in a dangerously quiet, terrifyingly measured tone that instantly silenced the room. He explicitly informed Megan that if she threw another object, raised her voice by one more decibel, or caused another single cent of property damage, he would immediately place her in heavy steel handcuffs. He promised with absolute certainty to arrest her on the spot for assaulting a sworn law enforcement officer and maliciously destroying property legally belonging to a private commercial trust. The immediate, highly credible threat of federal incarceration instantly neutralized her violent, explosive outburst. The remaining color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking chalky, hollow, and visibly trembling. She froze completely in the exact center of the ruined foyer, her arrogant dominance entirely pulverized by the raw, unyielding power of the state. Devon did not wait for any further instructions from the authorities. The absolute reality of the 30-minute countdown triggered a frantic, pathetic, and overwhelming survival instinct. He sprinted past the shattered ceramic fragments, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the wet rug, and scrambled up the grand wooden staircase. He tore into the massive master bedroom and began frantically ripping open mahogany drawers and custom-built closets. He could not afford the precious time required to carefully fold his belongings or locate his expensive matching designer luggage sets. He grabbed cheap, heavy, black plastic garbage bags from the hallway utility closet and began violently stuffing them with whatever basic necessities he could blindly grab. He reached with trembling hands for his vast collection of bespoke imported Italian suits hanging meticulously in the cedar wardrobe. Before his fingers could even graze the premium tailored fabric, the second deputy appeared silently in the bedroom doorway. The officer firmly instructed Devon to step away from the luxury garments immediately. He referenced the detailed asset seizure manifest physically attached to the court-ordered eviction notice. The deputy coldly explained that the highly valuable tailored suits, the expensive imported watches, and the premium leather shoes were legally classified as luxury assets. Those specific high-value items were now legally collateralized by the private equity firm to offset the massive commercial debt he had accrued. Devon was strictly forbidden from removing anything beyond basic, non-luxury clothing. He backed away from his prized wardrobe, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. He shoved a handful of cheap cotton t-shirts and faded denim jeans into the black plastic garbage bags, fully realizing the immense suffocating scale of his absolute ruin. The lead deputy stood firmly in the center of the foyer and checked the face of his heavy silver wristwatch. He announced in a loud, echoing voice that the strict 30-minute grace period had officially expired and it was time to leave the property immediately. Devon slowly descended the grand curved staircase, dragging two bulging, misshapen black garbage bags behind him. The cheap plastic tore slightly against the edge of the wooden steps, creating a pathetic scraping sound that perfectly illustrated his complete and total financial annihilation. Megan walked silently behind him, her eyes darting nervously around the expansive entryway. She was clutching her expensive tailored wool coat tightly against her chest, her posture unnaturally stiff, hunched and intensely guarded. I watched her erratic movements closely from the dark shadow of the dining room archway. I instantly recognized the desperate, calculating, and greedy glint flashing in her eyes. She was absolutely refusing to leave the premises empty-handed. As she marched purposefully toward the heavy oak front door, I stepped directly into her path, completely blocking her final exit. She stopped abruptly, glaring at me with raw, unfiltered hatred burning in her expression. I did not move a single inch or break my stoic composure. I stared directly at the unnatural, rigid, rectangular bulge hidden conspicuously beneath the heavy fabric of her designer coat. I calmly extended my right hand and demanded she surrender the stolen property immediately. She tightened her grip on the hidden object, vehemently denying the accusation and insisting in a shrill voice that she was only carrying her personal winter garments. I did not engage in a petty screaming argument with the thief. I reached calmly into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit and pulled out a faded yellowing piece of paper. I slowly unfolded the original 30-year-old purchase receipt for the heavy, antique brass mantel clock she currently had tucked under her arm. I held the fragile, undeniable document up to the light, clearly displaying my original signature and the highly detailed, authenticated description of the family heirloom. I informed her that attempting to smuggle a highly appraised, federally collateralized antique out of a legally seized property constituted grand larceny. I warned her that the armed deputies standing just 5 feet away would be more than happy to formally process the felony theft charges right there on the front porch. Megan shook with a furious, consuming, and entirely impotent rage. Her breathing grew incredibly heavy and ragged as the absolute futility of her situation crushed her final, desperate act of defiance. She slowly unbuttoned her tailored coat and pulled the heavy brass clock from its hiding place. She glared at me, her eyes burning with pure venom, and intentionally dropped the priceless antique directly onto the hardwood floor, hoping to shatter it. The brass held firm with a loud, ringing thud. She turned sharply on her heel, pushed aggressively past the waiting deputies, and walked out the door into the cold, unforgiving reality of her completely destroyed life. Megan's expensive designer heels clicked sharply against the exposed aggregate of the long driveway. She marched forward with her chin tilted aggressively upward, desperately attempting to project an aura of indignant superiority. Devon stumbled a few paces behind her, his posture completely hunched and utterly defeated. He dragged the 2 heavy black garbage bags across the rough pavement. The thin plastic tore against the concrete, creating a pathetic scraping sound that perfectly broadcasted his absolute financial annihilation. The flashing blue and red lights of the sheriff's cruisers had already functioned as a highly effective neighborhood beacon. The meticulously manicured lawns of the gated subdivision were now entirely lined with the very same affluent socialites Megan had spent years desperately courting. Word of the sudden eviction and police presence had spread through their exclusive neighborhood gossip network with lightning speed. Women holding imported wine glasses stood silently on their pristine brick porches. Men in tailored golf attire paused their evening putts to stare openly at the unfolding drama. The elite guests who had fled the disastrous dinner party only 24 hours earlier were now whispering behind manicured hands, pointing directly at her spectacular and highly public ruin. The visual contrast was absolutely devastating to Megan's carefully manufactured high society image. She was a woman in a wrinkled, rain-spotted designer suit, followed by a weeping husband hauling cheap polyester clothing in municipal trash bags. She glared fiercely at her former peers, expecting at least one sympathetic face or a polite offer of temporary refuge. Instead, heavy front doors quietly clicked shut and thick linen curtains were discreetly drawn. The neighborhood completely severed their social ties with her in real time. They recognized a sinking ship and possessed zero interest in dragging their own reputations down with her. Devin kept his bloodshot eyes locked firmly on the wet asphalt, entirely incapable of meeting the gaze of the wealthy neighbors he had once arrogantly bragged to. The crushing, judgmental silence of the audience was infinitely more devastating than any shouted insult could ever be. It was the ultimate public evaporation of Megan's suburban kingdom broadcast live to the exact people she cared about most. Megan shifted her focus away from the judgmental stares of her former friends and marched purposefully toward the curb. Her leased silver Mercedes SUV was parked directly under the warm glow of a wrought iron street lamp. She reached into her wool coat pocket, her shaking fingers grasping the electronic key fob, desperate to seek the isolated sanctuary of the pristine leather interior. Before she could even press the unlock button, the grinding heavy roar of a diesel engine shattered the quiet evening air. A massive, heavily battered commercial tow truck reversed sharply around the corner, its yellow hazard lights flashing aggressively. The driver executed a flawless sweeping maneuver, swinging the heavy rear chassis directly into Megan's path and completely blocking her access to the driver's side door. Megan shrieked in loud, hysterical protest. She waved her arms wildly, demanding the driver move his filthy industrial vehicle away from her luxury car immediately. The driver did not even acknowledge her presence. He pulled a heavy hydraulic lever located inside his cab. The thick steel towing armature lowered with a loud mechanical whine, sliding smoothly beneath the front axle of the silver Mercedes. Megan lunged forward, slapping her bare hands against the cold hood of her vehicle, screaming that she was the legal owner and explicitly threatening to have the man arrested for grand theft auto. The hydraulic lift engaged with a violent jarring shudder, instantly elevating the front tires of the Mercedes entirely off the pavement. The tow truck driver calmly opened his heavy metal door and stepped out onto the street. He was a large, imposing man wearing a stained canvas jacket and heavy work boots. He did not engage with Megan's frantic theatrical threats. He simply pulled a battered aluminum clipboard from his front pocket and tapped a thick red pen against a printed commercial ledger. He stated with absolute, bored professional detachment that the vehicle was officially repossessed by the primary lending institution due to 90 days of consecutive missed payments. He coldly explained that her secondary financial accounts had automatically triggered a hard default the exact second my private equity firm locked her corporate assets. The car legally no longer belonged to her. He tapped his heavy clipboard against the driver's side window of the suspended Mercedes, turned his back entirely on her screaming fit, and climbed effortlessly back into his elevated cab. Megan completely lost whatever fragile grip she had maintained on her sanity. She pounded her clenched fists against the thick, reinforced glass of the tow truck's passenger window, screaming a continuous stream of vicious, unhinged obscenities. She demanded her vehicle back immediately, loudly claiming she had critical social appointments and a high-profile lifestyle to maintain. The repossession agent completely ignored her frantic physical assault. He rolled up his window, engaged the heavy diesel transmission, and pressed his heavy boot against the accelerator. The massive truck pulled away from the curb with a loud metallic groan, dragging the silver Mercedes down the street and out of sight in a matter of seconds. Megan was left standing entirely alone in the middle of the street, her arms raised in the air, her breathing ragged and heavy. Devin dropped his torn black garbage bags onto the wet grass, staring blankly at the empty patch of asphalt where their final material asset had just vanished. They possessed absolutely no vehicle, no emergency currency, and no shelter to retreat to. The private equity firm had successfully stripped them down to the basic clothing currently resting on their backs. The harsh reality of their complete physical and financial isolation settled over them like an unbearable weight. The nearest municipal public transportation stop was located entirely outside the protective borders of the gated subdivision, requiring a grueling 2-mile walk down a steep, unlit commercial highway. Megan looked down at her expensive, fragile designer heels, realizing the utter impossibility of the journey. Devin did not wait for her to complain or issue another set of delusional demands. He picked up his tearing garbage bags, turned his back on the sprawling estate he had surrendered his fundamental dignity for, and began the long, humiliating march toward the main gate. Megan stood frozen on the street for a few seconds before reluctantly dragging her feet to follow his defeated path. As they crossed the invisible boundary separating the affluent protected neighborhood from the harsh reality of the public road, the sky above them rapidly darkened. The ambient temperature plummeted dramatically violently, signaling a sudden shift in the weather. A heavy freezing rain began to fall in thick, unforgiving sheets. The icy downpour soaked directly through Megan's expensive wool coat and flattened her meticulously styled hair against her pale face. The freezing rain relentlessly battered their shoulders as they trudged silently toward the distant flickering glow of the municipal bus shelter, leaving their ruined kingdom permanently behind them. I stood completely still on the covered porch, the cold wind whipping around the heavy oak pillars, and watched the two miserable figures slowly dissolve into the freezing, relentless downpour. The heavy sheet of rain quickly swallowed their retreating silhouettes, erasing the final physical trace of their toxic presence from the manicured perimeter of the neighborhood. I felt absolutely no pity for their sudden destitution. I felt no lingering parental guilt or sudden urge to intervene. I felt only the profound, absolute closure of a completely necessary correction. The natural order of respect, consequence, and accountability had been brutally but justly restored. I turned my back to the storm and stepped back inside, letting the heavy front door click firmly shut against the howling wind. The expansive foyer was dead silent, save for the faint, steady patter of rain against the high, arched windows. The house was finally mine again, but the interior still bore the offensive, superficial scars of Megan's desperate social climbing. I walked directly into the formal dining room and began the meticulous process of a complete physical cleansing. I systematically stripped the cheap, gaudy, mass-produced modern art canvases she had arrogantly plastered over the classic mahogany wainscoting. I tore down the flimsy metallic window treatments she had installed to mimic a generic boutique hotel aesthetic. I gathered the cheap reflective throw pillows and the fragile, impractical glass figurines she had scattered across the sturdy vintage furniture. I moved methodically from room to room, gathering every overpriced, soulless decorative accent she had used to overwrite my family's actual history. I piled the superficial junk into the center of the living room, creating a massive, pathetic monument to her hollow vanity. I dragged 3 heavy-duty municipal trash bins through the side door and aggressively shoved the entire collection of her aesthetic garbage into the dark plastic depths. I hauled the overloaded bins out the back door and pushed them violently into the oversized commercial dumpster resting at the edge of the service driveway. The heavy steel lid crashed down with a deafening metallic slam, definitively burying the last remnants of her parasitic occupation. The house felt instantly lighter, as if a suffocating layer of toxic dust had been scrubbed clean from the floorboards. The architectural integrity of the estate re-emerged from beneath the terrible shallow veneer she had forced upon it. Exactly an hour after the massive commercial dumpster swallowed the last of Megan's gaudy decorations, a sleek black sedan pulled smoothly into the freshly cleared driveway. Mr. Hayes, my lead corporate attorney and primary architect of the financial trap, stepped out into the lingering drizzle, holding a thick, waterproof leather briefcase. I unlocked the front door and welcomed him into the restored quiet sanctuary of the grand foyer. He wiped his polished shoes on the entry mat, unbuttoned his tailored charcoal suit jacket, and offered a rare, genuine smile of professional satisfaction. We walked into the adjacent home office, taking a seat at the heavy oak desk that had once served as the central command station for my early legitimate businesses. Mr. Hayes did not waste a single second with unnecessary pleasantries. He opened his briefcase and retrieved a crisp, heavy-stock legal folder. He slid the document directly across the polished wooden surface, pressing his index finger firmly against the bottom right corner. He informed me that the municipality had officially processed the accelerated foreclosure and completely cleared the administrative backlog. He handed me the final officially recorded deed transfer. The sprawling estate, the expansive property, and all attached equity were now completely unencumbered and legally registered solely under my name. The private equity firm had executed its mandate flawlessly, totally erasing the catastrophic debt Devon had cowardly acquired and returning the asset to its rightful owner. I stared down at the notarized signature, feeling a deep, quiet satisfaction wash over me. The trap had closed perfectly. Mr. Hayes then reached back into his briefcase and produced a second, much thinner folder containing the undeniable forensic banking evidence of Devon and Megan's previous financial crimes. He laid out the comprehensive stack of aggressively forged checks, explicitly detailing the exact dates and times the two of them had maliciously counterfeited my signature to illegally siphon capital from my protected accounts, funneling the stolen liquidity into their lavish, unsustainable lifestyle. Mr. Hayes leaned forward, his expression shifting into a mask of pure legal aggression. He asked for my explicit authorization to immediately forward the entire forensic dossier directly to the district attorney's office. He guaranteed that the overwhelming volume of physical evidence would secure a swift, brutal federal conviction. He wanted to know if I intended to pursue maximum criminal charges and ensure they spent the next decade in a maximum security penitentiary. I kept my gaze fixed on the undeniable evidence of their betrayal, but I slowly shook my head. I pushed the secondary folder containing the aggressively forged checks back across the polished oak desk, cleanly rejecting his aggressive legal strategy. I looked Mr. Hayes directly in the eye and calmly explained the fundamental flaw in seeking conventional criminal prosecution. I told him that federal prison, despite its harsh reputation, provides a highly structured environment with 3 guaranteed hot meals, free medical care, and a secure climate-controlled bed every single night. For a pair of individuals who had spent their entire adult lives being coddled, shielded, and financially subsidized, a federal penitentiary would essentially function as just another form of state-sponsored welfare. I explained that institutional incarceration offered an easy, cowardly escape from the immediate, brutal consequences of their catastrophic failure. Poverty, I noted, is the true, inescapable prison for people who worship money and social status above all else, stripping them of their wealth, destroying their pristine credit, and forcing them to survive in a harsh, unforgiving world without a single safety net would inflict a psychological punishment far more severe than any concrete cell could ever provide. Let them freeze at a public bus stop. Let them face the indignity of negotiating rent for a squalid, unheated apartment. Let them feel the crushing daily anxiety of absolute destitution, knowing they are entirely responsible for their own miserable existence. Mr. Hayes absorbed my ruthless logic in complete silence. He slowly nodded his head, expressing a deep, profound respect for the precise nature of the punishment. He securely packed the folders back into his waterproof briefcase, shook my hand firmly, and walked out the front door, leaving me alone in my reclaimed fortress. The rest of the evening passed in absolute, uninterrupted tranquility. The storm outside eventually broke, giving way to a freezing, silent night. I sat in my comfortable leather armchair, enjoying the quiet warmth of the crackling fireplace. At exactly 11 o'clock, the heavy silence was abruptly shattered by the sharp, piercing ring of the house telephone. I walked over to the console table and glanced down at the glowing digital caller ID screen. The incoming signal did not display a familiar contact name or a personal cell phone number. It simply read, "Municipal Public Payphone." I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. A trembling, desperate voice broke through the heavy static of the line. It was Devin. The static on the line popped and hissed, punctuated by the rhythmic, heavy sound of rain hitting a metal roof. Devin's voice came through the receiver, trembling so violently that his teeth were audibly chattering against the plastic mouthpiece of the public payphone. He painted a pathetic, visceral picture of his current reality. He was standing outside a cheap, dilapidated roadside motel on the absolute outskirts of the county, taking shelter under a rusted awning that did little to block the freezing downpour. The sheer arrogance that had defined his entire adult life was entirely absent, replaced by the raw, naked terror of a man who had finally run out of options. He did not ask for a massive corporate loan or a strategic legal bailout this time. He begged for basic physical salvation. He pleaded to be allowed back onto the estate, promising to occupy the damp, unfinished basement without a single complaint. He swore he would sleep directly on the cold concrete floor and eat only whatever discarded scraps were left behind in the kitchen. The former executive who had once scoffed at honest labor now frantically promised to work every single day, offering to take on any grueling physical task necessary to slowly repay the massive commercial debt he had cowardly incurred. He wept into the receiver, his voice cracking as he swore he would permanently abandon his arrogant facade and finally become the respectful, obedient son I had always wanted. He claimed the freezing rain had washed away his delusions, leaving him fully aware of the catastrophic mistakes he had made under the influence of his toxic, demanding marriage. He desperately offered his complete, unconditional submission in exchange for a warm corner to escape the bitter, relentless cold. I sat silently in my leather armchair, the radiant warmth of the crackling fireplace standing in stark physical contrast to the miserable, freezing reality radiating from the telephone receiver. I listened to his frantic, sobbing promises without interrupting, allowing the full weight of his absolute desperation to hang in the air between us. When his ragged breathing finally slowed, anticipating a desperate lifeline, I spoke with surgical, emotionless precision. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a single syllable of parental comfort or false hope. I calmly informed Devin that a man simply cannot learn how to climb out of a deep abyss until he has violently smashed against the absolute unyielding stone of rock bottom. Providing him with a warm basement and a comfortable safety net would only stunt his necessary evolution and actively reward his profound cowardice. I explicitly stated that his massive debt and his current state of destitution were the direct, mathematical consequences of his own spineless choices, and he would have to navigate that dark reality entirely on his own. Furthermore, I casually explained that his requested sanctuary was no longer available. I told him that the basement he wished to hide in was already scheduled for a complete and immediate renovation. I was actively converting the sprawling underground space into a fully equipped traditional woodworking shop. I intended to fill the space with heavy machinery, raw timber, and the honest, productive labor he had always so deeply despised. I clarified that my home was a place for creation and integrity, and it would absolutely never again serve as a subsidized shelter for a parasitic existence. The crushing finality of my refusal hung heavily over the crackling telephone line. Devin absorbed the cold reality that his ultimate safety net had been permanently dismantled and incinerated. A long, agonizing pause followed, filled only by the sound of the relentless rain striking the metal payphone booth and the distant hum of highway traffic. Then, in a moment of pure conditioned habit, a pathetic remnant of his shattered marriage surfaced. He weakly asked if there was any possible way Megan could accompany him, desperately bargaining to sleep in the unheated garden shed if it meant staying on the property. But before I could even issue a response, his voice completely broke. A fresh wave of agonizing, uncontrollable sobs racked his body. He choked on his words as he confessed the ultimate humiliating truth of his evening. He revealed that Megan had not even stayed with him long enough to board the municipal bus. While they were standing in the freezing mud at the bus stop, waiting in the torrential downpour, a passing vehicle had slowed down. It was a complete stranger in a warm, dry car. Without a single word of farewell, without a shred of hesitation or a backward glance, Megan had simply opened the passenger door and climbed inside. She had driven away into the night, instantly securing her own physical comfort and completely abandoning her husband on the side of the road with nothing but cheap garbage bags filled with wet clothing. She had discarded him the exact second his financial utility officially expired. Devin wept into the receiver, stating that he was utterly and completely alone in the world, violently stripped of his wealth, his marriage, and his fundamental dignity. He was a broken man standing in the dark, finally facing the absolute ruin he had engineered. I absorbed the information with total, unwavering detachment. It was the only logical conclusion to a marriage built entirely on greed and deception. I did not offer any false sympathy or parental reassurance. I did not say goodbye. I simply pulled the receiver away from my ear, placed it firmly back onto the cradle, and permanently severed the connection. Several weeks passed since that pathetic final phone call from the rain-soaked motel. The sprawling suburban estate finally shed the last lingering remnants of its former toxic occupants. The oppressive atmosphere of greed and superficiality completely evaporated, replaced by a profound, enduring tranquility. The expansive living room no longer echoed with shrill, entitled demands or the frantic pacing of financial ruin. Instead, the house smelled richly of fresh mahogany, lemon oil, and aged leather. I spent my mornings methodically restoring the architectural dignity of the property. I purchased new, sturdy, solid wood furniture to replace the flimsy, mirrored monstrosities Megan had used to infect my home. Down in the basement, the damp concrete walls now housed a functional, beautifully organized woodworking shop. The sharp, clean scent of cut pine and cedar drifted up the stairs, a daily testament to honest, productive labor. My life settled into a deeply satisfying, entirely unbothered routine. The natural order of my existence was fully restored, completely insulated from the chaotic fallout of Devin and Megan's catastrophic failure. That uninterrupted peace was temporarily breached on a quiet Tuesday afternoon by the arrival of the Daily Mail. The postal carrier required my physical signature for a thick, certified manila envelope. I signed the digital pad, took the heavy package into the kitchen, and sliced the top open with a steel letter opener. The return address printed in the corner belonged to a notoriously low-tier, volume-driven legal clinic located in a strip mall 2 counties over. I pulled out a disorganized stack of cheaply printed legal complaints and scanned the aggressively worded header. Megan was officially attempting to sue me in civil court for severe emotional distress, unlawful eviction, and the malicious destruction of her marital standard of living. The document was a masterclass in absolute unhinged delusion. She claimed my perfectly legal execution of the commercial default was a targeted campaign of psychological torture. She demanded exorbitant financial compensation for the sudden loss of her luxury vehicle and the supposed trauma of standing in the freezing rain. It was a pathetic, legally baseless attempt to extract one final payout from my accounts. She was entirely out of options, completely stripped of her previous offshore assets by her own mounting debts and grasping wildly at straws. I read the ridiculous demands twice, feeling absolutely zero concern. I did not entertain a single moment of anxiety over the frivolous lawsuit. I simply walked into my home office, placed the document face down on the glass scanner, and digitized the entire pathetic complaint. I immediately forwarded the digital file directly to Mr. Hayes with a brief 2-sentence directive instructing him to permanently neutralize the threat. Mr. Hayes operated with a level of ruthless legal precision that bordered on predatory. He did not merely file a standard dismissal. Within exactly 2 hours of receiving my email, he drafted and filed a brutal, overwhelming countersuit that completely dwarfed Megan's desperate civil claim. He bypassed standard procedural delays and submitted a devastating legal package directly to the presiding municipal judge. Mr. Hayes meticulously attached the undeniable hard forensic proof of her extensive check forgery, detailing the exact dates, times, and routing numbers of the funds she had maliciously siphoned from my protected pension accounts. He included the itemized photographic evidence of the documented property damage she had caused during her violent hysterical exit, specifically highlighting the shattered antique ceramic vase and the damaged hardwood flooring. However, the most lethal component of his legal counterstrike was a newly uncovered piece of evidence his private investigators had extracted during their financial autopsy of her offshore accounts. Mr. Hayes included a series of intercepted emails proving that exactly 1 week prior to the eviction, Megan had actively attempted to bribe a corrupt private physician. She had sought a fraudulent medical evaluation intended to preemptively declare me mentally incompetent and suffering from severe cognitive decline. Her ultimate failed strategy had been to forcefully seize medical power of attorney and liquidate my estate before her husband's commercial debt triggered the total asset seizure. She had actively conspired to medically incarcerate me for her own financial gain. The sheer volume and severity of the attached evidence instantly transformed her ridiculous civil complaint into a massive, undeniable confession of multiple federal felonies. Mr. Hayes did not request a settlement or offer a negotiation. He demanded an immediate dismissal of her claims with extreme prejudice and formally requested the court forward the entire evidentiary dossier directly to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. The trap I had set was already flawless, but Mr. Hayes reinforced the steel jaws, ensuring Megan could never safely attempt to approach my perimeter again. The sheer, unmitigated severity of Mr. Hayes's legal counterstrike yielded instantaneous results. The overworked pro bono attorney operating out of the strip mall clinic received the digitized countersuit and immediately reviewed the devastating attachments. The undeniable proof of grand theft, property destruction, and conspiracy to commit medical fraud represented a massive radioactive liability. He recognized instantly that representing a client engaged in such blatant documented criminality would subject his own vulnerable legal practice to severe ethical investigations. He completely panicked. In order to avoid potential disbarment and shield himself from the impending federal fallout, the attorney officially dropped Megan as a client before the courthouse doors even opened the following morning. He formally withdrew her civil complaint from the municipal docket, totally erasing her ridiculous lawsuit from existence. Her final, desperate attempt to extort my resources vanished entirely into the ether, leaving her fully exposed to the crushing reality of her destitution. With the last minor annoyance permanently eradicated, I resumed my quiet, peaceful routine. Later that morning, I drove my restored vintage truck down to my favorite local diner situated on the outer edge of the commercial district. The small, unassuming restaurant was a familiar sanctuary built on honest labor and simple, reliable service. I took my usual seat in the corner booth, enjoying the comforting hum of casual conversation and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. The seasoned waitress walked over to my table with a warm smile, carrying a steaming glass pot. She filled my ceramic mug to the brim and leaned casually against the edge of the laminated table. She shook her head with a mixture of mild pity and lingering disbelief. She casually mentioned that the morning shift had been unexpectedly interrupted by a highly unusual visitor. A young, completely disheveled man had stumbled through the front doors just after dawn, soaked to the bone and shivering violently. He did not ask for a menu or beg for a free meal. Instead, he had pleaded desperately with the restaurant manager, begging for a job washing dishes in the back kitchen. The waitress described him in precise detail. She noted his ruined, formerly expensive dress shoes, his torn, mud-stained slacks, and his frantic, bloodshot eyes. She remarked on how he had sworn he would scrub pots for minimum wage just to earn enough cash for a hot meal and a bus ticket out of the county. The physical description and the pathetic, groveling demeanor matched Devin perfectly. I slowly lowered my ceramic coffee mug onto the laminated table, digesting the waitress's casual observation with a profound, icy clarity. I did not immediately turn my head or make any sudden reactive movements. I simply thanked her for the fresh pour and shifted my posture slightly in the worn vinyl booth, adjusting my line of sight to gain a direct, unobstructed view of the swinging metal doors leading into the back kitchen. The diner was busy, filled with the loud clatter of silverware and the heavy scent of fried grease, providing perfect acoustic and visual cover for my silent surveillance. Every time a busboy pushed through the battered double doors to deposit a stack of dirty plates, a narrow sliver of the dishwashing station was briefly exposed to the main dining room. I sat with absolute stillness, waiting patiently for the rhythmic swing of the doors to reveal the truth of her claim. Finally, the hinges parted wide enough to offer a clear, sustained view of the steaming industrial sink. Standing directly over the massive stainless steel basin was Devin. He was virtually unrecognizable from the arrogant, posturing executive who had stood in my foyer just weeks prior. He wore a cheap, heavily stained canvas apron pulled tightly over a faded, oversized t-shirt. His posture was completely hunched, his spine curved under the brutal, repetitive physical strain of manual labor. Plumes of scalding chemical-scented steam rose from the basin, slicking his unkempt hair to his forehead and flushing his pale face with a sickly, exhausted redness. He was aggressively scrubbing a massive commercial stockpot, his bare arms submerged up to the elbows in dark, murky dishwater. The perfectly manicured hands that had once signed fraudulent six-figure financial documents were now raw, blistered, and thoroughly soaked in industrial detergent. I watched him wipe a thick layer of sweat from his brow with the back of a soapy forearm, his entire body moving with a sluggish, beaten lethargy. The profound, suffocating weight of absolute destitution had entirely stripped away his manufactured corporate arrogance, leaving behind nothing but a humbled, desperate man fighting simply to survive the afternoon shift. I felt no parental urge to rush through those doors and rescue him from his physical misery. I simply watched the brutal, necessary mechanics of consequence taking their rightful toll. The swinging kitchen doors suddenly burst open, propelled by the heavy, aggressive stride of the diner's daytime shift manager. He was a hardened, uncompromising man in a tight button-down shirt who clearly possessed absolutely zero tolerance for incompetence. I watched intently from the shadows of my corner booth as the manager marched directly up to Devin's workstation. He reached into the drying rack, pulled out a large aluminum roasting pan Devin had just finished cleaning, and shoved it aggressively back into the soapy water. The manager pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at a stubborn ring of scorched grease Devin had managed to overlook. Over the ambient din of the restaurant, I could clearly read the manager's hostile body language and the sharp, angry cadence of his verbal reprimand. He was delivering a humiliating, loud, and entirely public dressing down, berating Devin for his sloppy execution and threatening his employment over a single dirty pan. I leaned forward slightly, analyzing Devin's physiological response with intense, calculated interest. The old Devin, the heavily subsidized coward who had relied on my wealth and his wife's vicious manipulation, would have instantly snapped. He would have thrown a massive entitled tantrum, screamed about his elite social status, thrown the wet sponge at the manager's chest, and proudly stormed out the back door, fully assuming a soft financial safety net would catch his fall. I waited for the inevitable explosion of unearned pride. It never came. Devin froze for a fraction of a second, his shoulders tensing as the harsh insult landed. He stared down at the filthy roasting pan, his jaw clenching tight. Then the undeniable, terrifying reality of his absolute poverty forced his pride into total submission. Without his offshore accounts, without his luxury vehicles, and without my protective shadow, he possessed zero leverage. He slowly nodded his head, accepting the brutal humiliation without uttering a single word of protest. He reached his blistered hand into the murky water, gripped the abrasive steel wool with white-knuckled intensity, and began to scrub the scorched aluminum with a desperate, frantic energy. The ruthless, uncompromising strategy had worked flawlessly. The painful, unavoidable friction of rock bottom was finally forcing the boy to learn the brutal, honest value of labor. I did not slide out of my booth and walk into the steaming commercial kitchen. I did not tap him on the shoulder, offer him a warm, forgiving smile, or present a miraculous financial rescue package. Interfering with the painful forging process now would instantly undo every single agonizing lesson the freezing rain and the hot dishwater had taught him. The heavy, unyielding anvil of poverty was exactly where he needed to remain until the weak, entitled executive was completely hammered into a man of actual substance. I finished the last dark sip of my coffee and calmly stood up from the vinyl booth. I pulled my faded leather wallet from my pocket, retrieved a crisp $50 bill, and placed it securely underneath my empty ceramic mug. It was a silent, generous acknowledgement for the waitress, not a subsidy for the dishwasher struggling in the back. I turned my back on the swinging kitchen doors, walked smoothly out of the diner, and stepped into the crisp, biting afternoon air. I climbed into the cab of my restored vintage truck and navigated the familiar suburban roads back toward my property. The drive was remarkably quiet, completely devoid of the lingering anxiety that had plagued my life during Megan's toxic occupation. I pulled into the long, sweeping driveway and parked near the manicured front lawn. The sprawling estate stood tall, vast, and entirely uncompromised against the darkening evening sky. It was a fortress of absolute peace, completely cleansed of parasites and legally secured entirely under my name. I walked up the concrete steps to the grand front porch and retrieved my keys. I slid the heavy brass key into the newly installed high-security deadbolt. The lock disengaged with a solid, satisfying mechanical thud. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the pristine, silent foyer. I hung my jacket on the brass wall hook and walked slowly into the center of the expansive living room, savoring the immaculate, orderly emptiness of my reclaimed sanctuary. I stopped directly in front of the large flat-screen television mounted against the far wall. The screen was dark, reflecting the calm, undisturbed interior of the room, but my eyes remained firmly locked on the black glass, waiting for the final, inevitable piece of the puzzle to fall perfectly into place. I stepped away from the dark reflection on the glass and walked purposefully toward the absolute center of the expansive living room. My boots moved silently across the thick, freshly cleaned hardwood floors, leaving no trace of the heavy outdoor rain. Resting squarely in the middle of the open floor plan was my custom handcrafted leather armchair. I had personally commissioned the piece years ago, specifically selecting the rich, full-grain, distressed hide and the solid, reinforced oak frame. Megan had constantly banished this exact chair to the darkest corners of the attic, loudly claiming its masculine, rugged aesthetic completely ruined her meticulously curated, sterile designer motif. I ran my fingers along the smooth, dark leather armrests, feeling the familiar, comforting texture beneath my hands. I turned and lowered my body into the deep, supportive cushions. The chair groaned slightly, a welcoming, familiar sound that instantly anchored me to my restored domain. I leaned back, letting the tension completely drain from my shoulders. I reached over to the heavy mahogany side table and picked up the television remote control. I pointed the device directly at the massive screen and firmly pressed the power button. The dark glass instantly flared to life, illuminating the room with the vibrant, saturated green of a pristine football field. A highly anticipated Sunday night matchup was just entering the first quarter. I placed my thumb heavily on the volume toggle and pressed it upward, holding it down until the roaring sound of the stadium crowd vibrated through the premium surround sound speakers. The deep, resonant voice of the play-by-play announcer echoed forcefully off the high-vaulted ceilings, filling every empty corner of the grand estate. I sat in absolute unbothered peace, absorbing the sheer volume of the broadcast. There was no shrill, demanding voice echoing from the kitchen, complaining about the intolerable noise level. There were no manicured hands violently snatching the remote control from my grip to forcefully change the channel to a mindless reality television program. Most importantly, there was no arrogant, entitled son standing in the archway, aggressively ordering me to retreat down into the damp, unfinished basement so he could entertain his superficial friends. The sprawling, beautifully lit living room belonged entirely to me, and I intended to occupy every single square inch of it. I kept my eyes locked on the bright flashing screen, watching the heavy physical impacts on the football field, while my mind silently replayed the methodical journey of the past few months. I analyzed the complete total destruction of Devin and Megan's fraudulent suburban kingdom with a profound sense of analytical satisfaction. I had fundamentally restructured the power dynamics of my own life without ever raising my voice above a calm conversational register. I had entirely refused to engage in their hysterical, emotionally charged shouting matches. I did not resort to physical violence, petty property destruction, or cheap vindictive revenge tactics. Such base reactive behaviors are the desperate tools of the weak and the powerless. Instead, I employed surgical, uncompromising logic. I simply stepped back and analyzed the vast interconnected web of massive commercial debt they had foolishly woven around themselves. They had arrogantly attempted to weaponize the legal system, municipal foreclosure codes, and fraudulent medical evaluations to forcibly strip me of my wealth and my personal autonomy. I simply took those exact same structural mechanisms, seized the levers of corporate and financial power, and ruthlessly turned those systems against them. I allowed their own staggering greed to generate the gravitational pull of their absolute ruin. I let the unyielding mechanics of compound interest and corporate asset forfeiture act as my primary executioners. The strategy was brutally effective because it relied entirely on their own predictable parasitic behavior. I had patiently constructed a perfect, inescapable financial trap and simply waited for their unchecked arrogance to trigger the spring. They believed they were brilliant predators, but they were nothing more than remarkably gullible prey. I burned their false gilded kingdom entirely to the ground, and I accomplished the entire demolition using nothing but verified banking paperwork, forensic accounting, and endless calculating patience. I stripped them of their offshore accounts, their luxury vehicles, and their social standing without ever violating a single municipal statute or stepping outside the strict, rigid boundaries of corporate law. The correction was absolute because it was fundamentally undeniable. They could not argue with a hardened corporate ledger, and they could not outmaneuver a mathematically perfect legal default. I had taught them the ultimate crushing lesson about the true weight of consequence, delivering an unforgiving education they would carry with them for the rest of their miserable, impoverished lives. The bright, fast-paced action of the football game continued to play out across the massive screen, casting a warm, dynamic glow over the polished hardwood floors and the rich, dark leather of my armchair. I watched a brutal, perfectly executed tackle on the 50-yard line, appreciating the sheer, undeniable physics of the impact. I slowly stood up from my seat, leaving the roaring volume of the television broadcast completely unchecked. I walked with a steady, relaxed stride toward the custom built-in wet bar situated in the far corner of the expansive living room. I reached up into the glass front cabinet and retrieved a heavy lead crystal tumbler. I opened the locked climate-controlled liquor compartment beneath the mahogany counter and withdrew a pristine, unopened bottle of perfectly aged top-shelf single-malt whiskey. I broke the wax seal, twisted the heavy cork free, and poured a generous measure of the dark amber liquid directly into the heavy crystal glass. The rich, complex aroma of toasted oak, vanilla, and aged smoke instantly filled the immediate air. I returned the expensive bottle to its designated shelf, grasped the cold, textured glass in my right hand, and walked slowly back to the center of the room. I stood perfectly still, letting the heat of the fire and the roaring noise of the stadium crowd wash over me. The entire operation had been a flawless, brutal, and utterly silent correction. I had permanently neutralized the parasitic threat to my legacy and successfully reclaimed the absolute sovereignty of my own existence. I raised the heavy crystal tumbler slightly into the air, offering a private, silent toast to the ruthless, uncompromising mechanics of justice. I brought the rim of the glass to my lips and took a slow, measured sip. The top-shelf whiskey burned with a smooth, refined heat as it went down, warming my chest and perfectly punctuating the sweet, metallic taste of total victory. I looked around the pristine, empty expanse of the grand living room, feeling the profound, undeniable weight of true independence. I own my physical space. I own my absolute unbothered peace. And most importantly, I completely and fundamentally own my life. I lowered the glass, settling back into the deep comfort of the leather armchair, and allowed the roaring sounds of the stadium to fully consume the room as the screen slowly fades to black. True power is never loud, reactive, or driven by reckless emotional outbursts. It is cold, calculated, and deeply rooted in absolute patience. When you face individuals who view your kindness as weakness and your wealth as an inherent right, you must not lower yourself to their chaotic level. Instead, you observe their predictable patterns, gather irrefutable evidence, and allow their own staggering greed to orchestrate their ultimate downfall. The most brutal corrections are always executed in total silence. You secure your perimeter, reclaim your fundamental dignity, and let the unforgiving mechanics of reality teach the lessons you no longer will. Did you enjoy this story of calculated justice and silent correction? Let me know your thoughts on this ruthless strategy in the comments section below, and please do not forget to like, subscribe, and share for more empowering stories of ultimate accountability.